1975. Fall asleep to hilarious history. Being a compendium of human follies, polyester fabrics, and other sleep-inducing absurdities. By Mark Twain. Copyright 2026. James Henderson. Man is the only animal that blushes, or needs to, especially after looking at his high school yearbook photos from 1975. The author. Chapter 1. The Stay On tab and the End of the Aluminum Snow. It has long been my private and settled conviction that the progress of the human race is not a steady climb toward the light of reason, but rather a series of elaborate maneuvers designed to save ourselves from the consequences of our own previous inventions. Man is the only animal capable of creating a problem out of thin air, spending 40 years aggravating it, and then declaring himself a genius of the highest order when he finally devises a way to stop hitting himself in the face with his own umbrella. In the year of our Lord 1975, this cycle of self-inflicted misery and mechanical salvation reached a singular peak in the form of a small, hinged piece of aluminum that refused to go anywhere. Before this watershed moment, the American landscape was blanketed in what I can only describe as aluminum snow. It was a time of the pull tab, a device of such ingenious and malevolent design that it could only have been conceived by a committee of surgeons looking to increase the national demand for stitches and tetanus shots. The ritual of the beverage in those days was a two-act play. First, there was the pop, a sound of great industrial satisfaction, signaling that a refreshing draught of sarsaparilla or malted hops was now accessible. But this was immediately followed by the toss. You see, in the mid-60s and early 70s, the top of a can was designed to be completely liberated from its host. You hooked your finger into a ring, gave a vigorous tug, and were suddenly in possession of a jagged, curled ribbon of metal that possessed the structural integrity of a razor blade and the moral character of a pirate. What did the American citizen do with this unwanted shrapnel? He did what every red-blooded son of the Republic did in an era of boundless optimism and cheap gasoline. He threw it on the ground. He threw it into the tall grass. He buried it in the sand of the beach. He dropped it into the crystal-clear waters of the mountain stream. He scattered these little metal boomerangs across the continent with the lavish generosity of a king scattering gold coins to a crowd, oblivious to the fact that he was essentially seeding the earth with millions of tiny, silver-colored landmines. I recall a summer afternoon on the banks of the Mississippi, watching a gentleman of otherwise impeccable character enjoy a cold soda. With a flick of his wrist, he sent his pull tab sailing into the river mud. "Why did you do that, Silas?" I inquired. "Do you believe the catfish are in need of jewelry? Or are you merely hoping to provide a future archaeologist with a puzzle that will occupy his mind for a decade?" "It's the American way, Mark," Silas replied, wiping a bead of condensation from his brow. "It's disposable. That's the beauty of it. You use the thing, you lose the thing, and you never have to think about the thing again. It's freedom, pure and simple." It is a peculiar kind of freedom, I noted, that requires the rest of us to walk through the world in ironclad boots to avoid being sliced into ribbons by your liberty rings. By 1975, the aluminum snow had reached the proportions of a national crisis. The beaches of the great republic had become treacherous territories. A simple stroll through the surf was no longer a romantic endeavor. It was an exercise in tactical navigation. The soles of the American foot were in a state of constant quivering retreat. We had become a nation of limpers. We were being defeated by our own thirst, one jagged pull tab at a time. It was in this atmosphere of wounded toes and rising ecological guilt that a gentleman named Daniel F. Coudert, working for the Reynolds Metals Company, unleashed the Stay-On tab. It was a mechanical masterpiece of restraint. It was a tab that performed the pop, but adamantly refused to participate in the toss. It stayed where it was put, held fast to the can by a sturdy little rivet, like a dog on a short leash. The introduction of this device was met with a level of confusion that would have baffled a philosopher. The American public, having been trained for a generation to rip the head off their beverages, suddenly found themselves in a wrestling match with a piece of metal that wouldn't let go. I observed a fellow in a tavern in Cincinnati who spent the better part of 10 minutes trying to liberate a Stay-On tab from his can of ginger ale. He pulled, he twisted, he used a pair of pliers he happened to have in his pocket, and finally he gave a roar of frustration that shook the very rafters. "It's stuck," he cried, holding the mangled can aloft like a captured enemy. "The machinery has failed. I've paid my nickel, and the can is holding the ring hostage. It's an outrage. It's a violation of my constitutional right to litter." "Be calm, friend," I said. "It isn't stuck. It's environmentally conscious. It is designed to stay with the can, so that you might take it to a bin, rather than leaving it in the grass to be discovered by the foot of a passing child." "But it gets in the way of my nose," he protested. "When I tilt the can back, the tab presses against my nostril with the cold indifference of a tax collector's heart. How am I supposed to enjoy my drink with a mechanical thumb pushing on my face?" This was the great psychological hurdle of 1975. We had to learn to drink with our trash. We had to accept that our disposable culture was being replaced by a connected culture, a world where the things we used remained our responsibility even after we were done with them. It was a profound and unsettling shift in the national character. We were being asked to grow up, and we were finding the process remarkably itchy. But oh, the peace that followed. As the Stay-On tab took hold, the aluminum snow began to melt away. The beaches became safe for bare feet once more. The sound of the toss, that light metallic clink on the pavement, was replaced by the heavy, muffled silence of a can being placed properly into a receptacle. There is a deeply sleep-inducing quality to this transition. Imagine the quiet of a beach in the late autumn of 1975. The waves are lapping at the shore with a rhythmic, steady pulse. Wash. Shh. In the old days, you would have seen the glint of 1,000 pull tabs reflecting the moonlight, each one a tiny threat waiting in the dark. But tonight, the sand is smooth. It is a vast, uninterrupted blanket of pale gold. The metal ghosts have been laid to rest. Think of the Stay-On tab itself. It is a study in stillness. It doesn't want to go anywhere. It is content to stay exactly where it was born, resting against the top of the can like a tired traveler leaning against a wall. It has done its job. It has opened the door, and now it is happy to just be part of the furniture. As you settle into your blankets, imagine that you are a Stay-On tab. You aren't being pulled. You aren't being tossed. You are securely riveted to your own little corner of the world. The pop of the day's activities is over. The pressure has been released. The aluminum snow of your worries All those jagged little thoughts that usually cut into your peace of mind has been gathered up and put away. The world is no longer a place of sharp edges and discarded remnants. It is a world of connections, where everything is held firmly in place by a divine and benevolent rivet. You don't have to worry about where you're going, because you aren't going anywhere. You are staying on. You are resting. The night is cool, the sand is soft, and the only thing popping is the occasional bubble of a dream in the back of your mind. The republic is safe, the toes of the nation are healing, and the trash is exactly where it belongs. Good night, Mr. Cootert. Good night, Reynolds Metals. Good night to the jagged rings of the past. The snow has stopped falling, the ground is clear, and the silence of the stay-on tab is the sweetest lullaby a weary traveler could ask for. Next chapter, The Tragedy of the Leisure Suit. An inquiry into why the human race decided to dress like upholstered patio furniture and the subsequent moral decay of the neighborhood disco. Chapter 2. The Tragedy of the Leisure Suit. It has been said that God made man in his own image, but it was the DuPont Chemical Company that decided to give him a second skin of double-knit polyester. If the pet rock was the silent companion of the 1975 soul, then the leisure suit was its loud, synthetic, and inexplicably flammable outer shell. It was a garment that did not so much clothe a man as it did upholster him, turning every accountant, plumber, and shopkeeper into a walking piece of lounge furniture. To understand the leisure suit, one must first understand the fundamental human desire to look like a person of consequence while possessing the structural integrity of a marshmallow. For centuries, the civilized world had labored under the tyranny of wool. Wool was a demanding master. It required shearing from a bewildered sheep, spinning by a weary laborer, and tailoring by a man of great patience. It wrinkled if you looked at it sideways, and it smelled like a damp barn if you were caught in a spring rain. But in the mid-'70s, we decided we had outgrown the sheep. We turned instead to the oil well. There is something inherently suspicious about a suit that begins its life as a barrel of crude petroleum. It is a triumph of chemistry over common sense. This miracle fabric, polyester, was sold to the American public on a promise of eternal youth. It would never wrinkle, never fade, and never, under any circumstances, allow the human body to breathe. Wearing a leisure suit was like living inside a Tupperware container. You remained remarkably preserved, but you were slowly stewing in your own juices. The design of the garment itself was a marvel of geometric aggression. The lapels were not merely lapels, they were great, sweeping wings of fabric that extended toward the shoulders like the ears of an African elephant. They were so vast that a man of modest stature might, in a stiff breeze, find himself inadvertently lifted off the pavement and carried toward the next county. These lapels were often accentuated by top stitching, a series of bold, contrasting threads that traced the edges of the suit like the dotted lines on a highway, as if to guide the eye toward the inevitable catastrophe of the wearer's countenance. And then there were the colors. Nature, in her infinite wisdom, provides us with greens and browns and blues that soothe the eye and rest the spirit. The textile mills of 1975, however, looked upon nature and found it lacking in pizzazz. They gave us seafoam green, a color that suggested a mermaid had suffered a severe bout of seasickness. They gave us harvest gold, which looked like a wheat field that had been cursed by a vengeful sorcerer. They gave us powder blue, a shade so delicate and innocent that when draped over a 6'4" construction foreman named Tex, it created a visual dissonance that could cause a man to lose his lunch. The true genius, or the true villainy, of the leisure suit lay in its rejection of the necktie. The necktie is a symbol of the old world. It is a refined noose that reminds a man he is a servant to society. The leisure suit dispensed with this entirely, favoring instead the open collar. This collar was designed to be spread wide across the lapels, revealing a vast expanse of chest hair and, quite often, a gold medallion the size of a dinner plate. It was the uniform of a man who was on the move, though usually he was only moving toward the nearest fern bar to order a drink that involved an umbrella and a regrettable amount of crème de menthe. I once observed a gentleman in a suburb of St. Louis who had achieved the pinnacle of this sartorial madness. He was clad in a leisure suit of a color I can only describe as injured salmon. It was a double-knit masterpiece that shimmered with a faint, oily sheen under the midday sun. As he walked, the fabric made a rhythmic, swishing sound, the polyester percussion that heralded his arrival from 2 blocks away. He looked entirely satisfied with himself. He looked like a man who had conquered the problem of existence by simply deciding that nothing mattered as long as his trousers stayed creased. "Good morning, sir," I said, for I am a man who appreciates a spectacle. "That is a remarkable plumage you're sporting." "It's the future," he replied, patting his hip where the fabric resisted the impression of his hand with the stubbornness of a radial tire. "I haven't used an iron in 3 weeks. I could sleep in this suit, go for a swim in it, and attend a funeral in it, and it would look exactly the same." "Indeed," I mused, "and so would you eventually, as the fabric is likely to outlast your mortal remains by several thousand years. Archaeologists of the future will find you perfectly preserved in your salmon-colored sarcophagus, a monument to the great plastic age." He didn't care. He was a man of leisure. That was the word that sold the suit. In 1975, everyone wanted leisure, even if they had to work 60 hours a week to afford it. We were a nation trying to relax by force. We bought recliner chairs that looked like giant leather baseball mitts. We bought modular sofas that could be rearranged into a padded fortress, and we bought suits that signaled to the world that we were ready to nap at a moment's notice. The leisure suit was the ultimate sleep-inducing garment, because it represented the death of ambition. A man in a 3-piece wool suit is a man who might start a revolution or build a railroad. A man in a leisure suit is a man who is thinking about whether he should have the shrimp cocktail or the potato skins. It is a garment of low stakes and high visibility. There was a subtle psychological horror to the leisure suit as well. Because it was made of knitted plastic, it had a certain give to it. It stretched. It accommodated the various indignities that middle age visits upon the human frame. If a man gained 10 pounds of leisure around his midsection, the suit simply expanded to hold it, like a friendly boa constrictor. This was a dangerous mercy. It allowed a man to believe he was still the same lithe youth he had been in 1962, right up until the moment he caught sight of himself in a plate glass window and realized he looked less like a human being and more like a very large, very blue grape. By the time the year drew to a close, the leisure suit had begun to undergo a slow, painful decline. The world was beginning to realize that while polyester was durable, it was also remarkably good at absorbing and retaining the odors of the environment. A man who spent an evening in a smoky bowling alley would find that his suit had memorized every puff of a Winston and every splash of stale beer. No amount of Febreze, had it existed, could have exorcised the ghost of a Friday night from a 1975 leisure suit. But for one glorious, shimmering year, we walked the earth in our plastic glory. We were a tribe of pastel-colored giants, rustling through the malls and the office parks, untroubled by wrinkles, unbothered by elegance. As you drift off now, imagine the sound of that polyester swish. Imagine the softness of a knit that has no business being so close to human skin. Feel the weight of the seafoam green lapels pressing gently against your shoulders like the hands of a very tired angel. The world is safe, the suit is permanent, and there isn't an iron in sight. Good night, my friends. Sleep deeply, for tomorrow we must discuss the peculiar habit of our presidents falling down the stairs of airplanes. Chapter 3. Mr. Ford's Incredible Moving Sidewalk. It has always seemed to me a gross oversight on the part of the architect of the universe that gravity was not made elective, or at the very least, subject to a presidential veto. One would think that the high office of the presidency, with its attendant dignity, its trumpets, and its vast naval escorts, would carry with it a certain celestial immunity from the indignity of tripping over one's own feet. Yet, in the year of our Lord 1975, we were presented with a chief executive who seemed to be engaged in a private, spirited, and ultimately losing war with the very ground he walked upon. Gerald Ford was a man of remarkable virtues. He was as solid as a Michigan oak and as honest as a day's work in a lumber yard. He was a man who had been handed the reins of a bucking and terrified government not because he had sought the privilege, but because he was the only man left in Washington whose reputation hadn't been through a paper shredder. He was, by all accounts, a superb athlete, a star football player in his youth who could likely have tackled a runaway locomotive and come out the better for it. And yet, the moment the cameras of the world were trained upon him, the president's relationship with the laws of physics became suddenly and spectacularly complicated. There is a particular kind of clumsiness that belongs only to the truly athletic. A man who has never moved a muscle in his life expects to trip. He is a connoisseur of the stumble, a veteran of the misplaced toe. But when a man of grace and strength suddenly finds himself betrayed by a staircase, it is a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions. For Gerald Ford, the primary antagonist of his administration was not the Soviet Union, nor the rising price of bread, but the exit ramp of Air Force One. The most famous of these skirmishes occurred in June of 1975 in the city of Salzburg. Now, Salzburg is a lovely place, famous for its music and its mountains, but on that particular day, it was also famous for being exceedingly damp. The president emerged from his silver and blue chariot, a man of international stature, ready to discuss the fate of nations. He waved to the cheering crowds with the practiced ease of a statesman. He began his descent, and then, as if the spirit of some mischievous alpine sprite had greased the treads of the staircase, the leader of the free world became a human toboggan. It was not a mere trip, A trip is a brief interruption of a walk. This was a grand, sweeping, physical manifesto. The president skipped several steps entirely, his feet choosing to explore the possibilities of the air rather than the stability of the metal, and he arrived at the bottom of the ramp in a manner that can only be described as abrupt. He didn't just land. He joined the Austrian soil with a suddenness that likely registered on seismographs in Switzerland. Now, a lesser man, a man of thinner skin or more fragile ego, would have stayed there, perhaps pretending he had intended to inspect the tarmac for cracks. But Mr. Ford, possessing that Midwestern resilience that is the envy of the world, popped back up like a toasted muffin. He straightened his tie, brushed off his knees, and proceeded to behave as though he had simply discovered a more efficient way of getting downstairs. But the damage was done. The press, a breed of creatures who live for the moment a king loses his crown in a mud puddle, had their story. For the rest of 1975, Gerald Ford was no longer the man who had healed the wounds of Watergate. He was the man who couldn't walk across a level room without endangering the furniture. It became a national pastime to watch the president negotiate the world. We watched him bump his head on the doorway of helicopters with the rhythmic consistency of a woodpecker. We watched him tangle his feet in the cords of microphones as if they were venomous snakes intent on his destruction. There was a rumor, likely started by some wag in a darkened tavern, that the White House staff had considered carpet lining the entire District of Columbia and rounding off the corners of the Washington Monument, just to be safe. The irony, of course, was that while the president was stumbling through doorways, the nation itself was stumbling through the dark. We were a people looking for a firm footing, and every time we saw our leader lose his, it felt like a cosmic metaphor. If the man with the nuclear codes couldn't master a flight of stairs, what hope had the rest of us of navigating the treacherous slopes of the late 20th century? This perception was helped along by a young man named Chevy Chase, who, on a new television program called Saturday Night Live, turned the president's perceived lack of balance into a comedic high art. Mr. Chase would appear on the screen and promptly hurl himself over podiums, through Christmas trees, and into the laps of bewildered audience members. It was a caricature of a man who was already a caricature of himself. The American public laughed, not out of malice, I think, but out of a profound sense of relief. In a world of cold wars and oil embargoes, there was something deeply comforting about a man who was simply, humanly, hilariously clumsy. I had the occasion to discuss this with a gentleman of my acquaintance, a man who had spent 40 years as a surveyor and knew more about the incline of the earth than most men know about their own wives. "The problem," the surveyor said, puffing on a pipe that smelled of old socks and cherry tobacco, "is not that the president is clumsy. The problem is that the earth is slanted in his presence. It is a known fact of magnetism. A man of that much authority creates a gravitational pull that confuses his own inner ear. He isn't falling, he's just reacting to a world that won't sit still for him." "That is a very generous assessment," I replied. "I suppose you'll tell me next that when he hit his head on the helicopter, it was the helicopter that was at fault for being too low?" "Precisely," the surveyor said. "A president should not have to duck for anything. It is the duty of the machine to rise to his height, not the duty of the man to shrink for the machine." It is a pleasant thought, is it not? To imagine a world where the stairs are to blame and the ground is the aggressor. As we look back at 1975, we should remember Gerald Ford not with mockery, but with a certain kind of weary affection. He was our stumble-in-chief, a man who showed us that you can fall down in front of the entire world and still get up, dust yourself off, and carry on with the business of the day. There is a great deal of dignity in that, perhaps more than there is in never falling at all. A man who never trips is a man who isn't moving. Gerald Ford was moving. He was just doing it with a bit more gusto than the floorboards could handle. So, as you lay your head upon your pillow this evening, take a moment to appreciate the stillness of your bed. It is a stationary object. It does not have stairs. It does not have a doorway that will jump out and strike you in the forehead. You are, for this moment, safer than the President of the United States. Think of Mr. Ford, tucked away in the White House, perhaps dreaming of a world made entirely of Nerf foam. Imagine him walking across a cloud where the footing is soft and the gravity is merely a suggestion. The world is a slippery place, full of rain-slicked ramps and deceptive rugs, but for tonight the ground is level, the lights are low, and the only thing likely to fall is the darkness. Good night, Salzburg. Good night, Washington. Watch that first step. It's a doozy, but it's only the earth reaching out to say hello. Chapter 4. The Great Shark Scare. It has been my long-standing suspicion that the human imagination is a faculty designed primarily for the purpose of making its owner miserable. Man is the only creature on this green earth who will spend his hard-earned wages to sit in a darkened room, eat salted corn until his throat is as parched as the Sahara, and watch a flickering illusion of a giant fish eating a boat, only to emerge into the sunlight, convinced that his own bathtub has become a den of prehistoric assassins. In the summer of 1975, a young stripling of a director named Steven Spielberg, a lad who, at the time, looked as though he might still be required to show identification to purchase a sarsaparilla, released a moving picture titled Jaws. Now, I have seen many things in my time that were intended to inspire terror. I have seen a steamboat boiler on the verge of a tantrum. I have seen a tax collector with a ledger in his hand and a coldness in his eye, and I have seen a Missouri mule with a grievance. But none of these spectacles achieved the total shivering paralysis of the American public that was wrought by a mechanical fish named Bruce. One must understand the singular nature of the shark in the human mind. Until 1975, the shark was a distant relative, a creature of the deep that mostly bothered sailors, pearl divers, and people who had the misfortune of falling off a pier in the middle of the night. To the average citizen of Ohio or Nebraska, a shark was as remote and theoretical as a unicorn or an honest politician. But after Jaws, the shark became a personal neighbor. It was no longer a fish. It was a ghost, a demon, a relentless, toothy machine that lived for no other purpose than to interrupt a summer vacation. The brilliance of Mr. Spielberg's work lay not in what he showed us, but in what he didn't. You see, the mechanical shark, Bruce, was a temperamental actor. He suffered from a variety of electronic maladies that caused him to sink to the bottom of the Atlantic, refuse to open his mouth, or simply stare at the camera with the blank, uncomprehending gaze of a man being asked to explain the New York City budget. Had the shark worked perfectly, we might have seen him too often and realized he was merely a collection of hydraulic pumps and painted rubber. But because Bruce was a failure as a machine, he became a triumph as a nightmare. He remained hidden beneath the waves, heralded only by two notes of music that sounded like the heartbeat of doom itself. Da-dum, da-dum. Those two notes did more to damage the American tourism industry than 1,000 outbreaks of the mumps. It is a testament to our inherent absurdity that a grown man, a man who might have survived the Great Depression, fought in 3 wars, and raised 6 children, could be reduced to a quivering jelly by a cello player. I observed a fellow at a seaside resort in New Jersey that July who refused to dip his toe into a tidal pool that was no deeper than a saucer and contained nothing more menacing than a confused hermit crab. "Step in, Silas," I said to him. "The water is fine, and the most dangerous thing in there is a bit of seaweed that might tickle your ankle." Silas looked at the water with the suspicion of a man looking at a ticking parcel. "That's what they want you to think," he whispered. "He's down there. He's waiting. He's got black eyes, like a doll's eyes, and he doesn't even blink when he's biting you in half." "Silas," I reminded him, "we are currently 300 yards from the nearest actual ocean, and this is a puddle left behind by a particularly vigorous lawn sprinkler." "It doesn't matter," Silas replied, his eyes wide with a frantic cinematic light. "He can swim through the pipes. He can come up through the drain. I saw the poster, Mark. The girl was just swimming along, minding her own business, and then, crunch, no more girl, just a lot of red ink in the water. This was the State of the Union in 1975. We were a nation of land sharks. The terror was so pervasive that people who had lived their entire lives in the middle of the Great Plains, where the nearest salt water was 1,000 miles away in either direction, began to feel a certain trepidation when crossing a damp meadow. There was a rumor that sales of backyard swimming pools plummeted, not because of the cost of chlorine, but because the American public was half convinced that a 25-foot great white might spontaneously manifest in 4 feet of filtered water. The irony, of course, is that while we were all terrified of being eaten by a fish, we were perfectly content to drive about in cars that had the structural integrity of a biscuit tin and smoke cigarettes as though they were a form of vitamin. We are a species that ignores the slow, grinding dangers of reality in favor of the sudden, spectacular dangers of the imagination. We would rather worry about a shark that isn't there than a cholesterol level that definitely is. Mr. Spielberg's shark did more than just ruin the summer. It changed the very nature of how we go to the theater. Before 1975, a blockbuster was something that happened in a war. After 1975, it was a line of people stretching around 3 city blocks, all waiting to be frightened out of their wits. We discovered that we enjoyed the communal shiver. We liked the feeling of being in a crowd where everyone screamed at the same time when a severed head floated out of a hole in a boat. It was a bonding experience, a way for a fractured nation to find common ground. We were all collectively afraid of the water. Even the scientists, those somber men who spend their lives counting the scales on a perch and telling us things we don't want to know, tried to intervene. They pointed out that sharks do not, as a rule, have a particular fondness for the taste of humans. They explained that a shark would much rather have a nice fatty seal or a slow-moving tuna than a bony, sun-tanned tourist who tastes mostly of coconut-scented oil and regret. But facts are a weak defense against a well-placed musical score. You can tell a man that the odds of being bitten by a shark are 1 in several million, but as soon as he steps into the surf and something slimy brushes against his calf, those millions vanish, and he is convinced he is the one. I recall a lady of my acquaintance who took the shark scare so to heart that she refused to eat tuna fish for the better part of a year. "It's a matter of principle," she told me, over a lunch of very safe, very terrestrial chicken. "If I eat the fish has a right to eat me. It's only fair, and I don't want to give them any ideas." "Madam," I said, "the tuna is a different creature entirely. It is a noble fish, to be sure, but it lacks the dental ambition of the great white. You are essentially punishing a sparrow because you are afraid of a hawk." "They all swim in the same place," she said firmly. "They talk to each other. They have a network. I'm staying on the land where the only thing that can eat me is a bear. And at least a bear has the decency to look like a rug before he attacks." By the time the autumn leaves began to fall, the great shark scare had begun to recede, much like the tide. We realized that we had survived the summer without being consumed, and we began to look back on our panic with the faint, sheepish grin of a man who has just realized he spent 10 minutes shouting at a coat rack in the dark. Bruce the shark was dismantled and put into storage, his mechanical organs quiet, his rubber skin peeling in the California sun, but the damage to our collective psyche was permanent. To this day, no man can swim out past the breakers, feel the vast cold emptiness of the ocean beneath him, and not hear those 2 insistent notes of the cello. We are haunted by the ghost of a movie prop. As you settle into your covers tonight, rest easy. There are no sharks in your bedroom, the carpet is dry, the plumbing is secure, and the only Bruce you're likely to encounter is a neighbor who wants to borrow your lawnmower. The ocean is far away, and its inhabitants are busy with their own affairs, none of which involve your toes. Sleep now, and dream of calm waters and sunny shores, but perhaps, just to be safe, keep your feet under the blanket. You never know when the soundtrack might start up again. Chapter 5. The Altair 8800, the box that did nothing. It is a curious and persistent trait of the human animal that we are never quite satisfied with the simple machinery of nature. A man is given a perfectly serviceable pair of legs, yet he must invent the bicycle, which requires him to balance like a tightrope walker while pedaling like a frantic duck. He is given a voice that can carry across a cornfield, yet he must invent the telephone, so that he may be interrupted by a stranger while he is eating his supper. But in the year of our Lord 1975, the spirit of invention took a turn so bizarre, so utterly devoid of immediate utility, that it remains the most spectacular example of our collective madness. The birth of the home computer, specifically a blue metal crate known as the Altair 8800. Now, if you were to encounter a machine today, you might expect it to possess certain basic courtesies. You would expect it to have a keyboard for the typing of letters, a screen for the viewing of pictures, and perhaps a small plastic rodent known as a mouse to scurry across your desk. The Altair 8800 possessed none of these things. It was, for all intents and purposes, a sophisticated paperweight that happened to consume electricity and emit a faint, technological hum. It looked less like a miracle of the space age and more like a piece of hospital equipment that had been rejected for being too depressing. I recall seeing one of these contraptions in the workshop of a young man who was regarded by his neighbors as either a prophet or a lunatic. And in 1975, the line between the two was as thin as a polyester thread. The machine sat upon a sturdy wooden table, its front panel adorned with a bewildering array of tiny switches and a series of red lights that glowed with the sinister patience of a cat watching a mouse hole. "What does it do?" I asked the young man, who was currently engaged in a ritual that involved flipping the switches with the speed and intensity of a concert pianist playing a particularly difficult concerto. "At the moment," he replied without looking up, his eyes glazed with a sort of holy fervor, "it is remembering the number 4. "It is remembering the number 4? I repeated. "My dear boy, I have a nephew of 4 years who can remember the number 4, and he also has the added benefit of being able to fetch my slippers. Why have you paid several $100s for a metal box to perform a task that a toddler can manage between bouts of eating paste?" "You don't understand," he whispered. "I'm programming it. I'm speaking to the machine in its own language. It's binary, ones and zeros, high voltage and low voltage. It is the language of the universe." I watched him for a further 20 minutes. He flipped switches up, he flipped switches down. He consulted a manual that was thicker than the family Bible and significantly more difficult to interpret. After a great deal of sweating and a fair amount of what I suspect was profanity whispered under his breath, he threw a final switch. 2 of the red lights on the front panel blinked. Then they stayed on. "There!" he cried, triumphant. "It has added 2 and 2. "And what is the result?" I inquired. "The lights are on," he said, as if that explained everything. "That represents the number 4 in binary. It worked." I stood there for a moment, contemplating the majesty of human progress. We had reached a point where a man would spend 3 hours of back-breaking labor and a month's wages to convince a machine to tell him something he already knew, using a visual code that required a degree in mathematics to decipher. It was a triumph of the difficult over the useful. It was as if a man decided that instead of walking to the well for a bucket of water, he would build a 3-mile aqueduct out of hollowed-out toothpicks, simply to prove that the water could be moved by engineering. The Altair 8800 was born from the pages of Popular Electronics magazine, a publication that catered to men who enjoyed the scent of molten solder and the thrill of a short circuit. The machine was sold as a kit, which meant that when it arrived at your door, it was not a computer at all, but rather a cardboard box, filled with hundreds of tiny, incomprehensible parts that looked like the droppings of a very small metallic bird. To turn these parts into a computer, one had to possess the patience of Job and the steady hand of a diamond cutter. One had to spend weeks hunched over a kitchen table, inhaling lead fumes and trying to determine if a resistor was burnt orange or sunset red. If you were successful, and if the gods of electricity were feeling particularly merciful, you ended up with the Altair. And then, having built it, you realized with a sudden cold clarity that there was absolutely nothing to do with it. There were no programs to buy. There was no internet to browse. You couldn't even use it to write a letter to your mother to tell her you had wasted your inheritance. It was a magnificent, expensive, blinking nothing. And yet, this is where the story takes a turn toward the truly significant. Because the machine was so useless, it attracted a particular breed of dreamer, the kind of person who sees a desert and imagines an orchard. In a small town in New Mexico, two young men named Bill and Paul looked at this blinking blue box and decided that what it needed was a soul. They stayed up for weeks, fueled by caffeine and the sheer arrogance of youth, to write a language called BASIC for the Altair. They were selling software, a word that in 1975 sounded like something used to describe a particularly comfortable pair of trousers. They were selling instructions for a machine that did nothing, so that it might eventually do something. It was a business model based entirely on hope and the assumption that the world would soon be filled with people who wanted to flip switches in their spare time. As it turns out, they were right. We are now a planet of switch flippers, though our switches have become invisible and our boxes have become thin enough to fit in a pocket. But in 1975, the Altair was the king of the hobbyists. These were men, and they were almost exclusively men, for women have generally had more sense than to spend their evenings talking to a mute box, who formed clubs to discuss the Altair. They would gather in garages and high school cafeterias, carrying their blue boxes with the care one might afford a wounded war hero. They would trade stories of memory leaks and bus errors with the same gravity that old sailors trade stories of krakens and typhoons. I found the whole spectacle deeply sleep-inducing, which is perhaps the greatest compliment I can pay it. There is no sound in the world quite as conducive to a long, deep slumber as the rhythmic click-clack of a binary switch and the low-frequency hum of a power transformer. If you are struggling to find rest tonight, I invite you to imagine yourself in a wood-paneled basement in Albuquerque. The air is thick with the smell of ozone and old coffee. A single light bulb hangs from the ceiling. Before you sits the Altair 8800. You reach out and flip the first switch. Click. A red light glows. You flip the second. Click. Another light joins it. You have 8,000 switches left to flip before the machine will do anything at all. You begin the process. Click, click, click. Your mind begins to wander. You aren't thinking about your taxes. You aren't thinking about the state of the world. You are thinking only of the red lights. They are so warm, so steady, so utterly meaningless. The Altair doesn't care if you finish the program. It doesn't care if you fall asleep right there on the workbench. It has all the time in the universe. It is a rock that we have taught to think, but for now, it is content to just be. It is the ultimate electronic lullaby, a machine that asks everything of your attention and gives you nothing in return but a steady crimson glow. As the year 1975 rolled on, the Altair paved the way for things that would eventually change the world. But in its own moment, it was just a beautiful, baffling folly. It was a symbol of a year that was trying to invent the future, but hadn't quite figured out where the on switch was. So, close your eyes. Imagine the red lights fading one by one as the power is cut. The hum dies away. The room is dark. The switches are silent. The box is just a box again. And you are just a dreamer, drifting off into a world where the only language is the silence of the stars. Good night, Albuquerque. Good night, Altair. May your lights be dim and your memory be short. Chapter 6. The Stay On tab and the End of the Aluminum Snow. It has long been my private and settled conviction that the progress of the human race is not a steady climb toward the light of reason, but rather a series of elaborate maneuvers designed to save ourselves from the consequences of our own previous inventions. Man is the only animal capable of creating a problem out of thin air, spending 40 years aggravating it, and then declaring himself a genius of the highest order when he finally devises a way to stop hitting himself in the face with his own umbrella. In the year of our Lord 1975, this cycle of self-inflicted misery and mechanical salvation reached a singular peak in the form of a small, hinged piece of aluminum that refused to go anywhere. Before this watershed moment, the American landscape was blanketed in what I can only describe as aluminum snow. It was a time of the pull tab, a device of such ingenious and malevolent design that it could only have been conceived by a committee of surgeons looking to increase the national demand for stitches and tetanus shots. The ritual of the beverage in those days was a two-act play. First, there was the pop, a sound of great industrial satisfaction, signaling that a refreshing draught of sarsaparilla or malted hops was now accessible. But this was immediately followed by the toss. You see, in the mid-60s and early 70s, the top of a can was designed to be completely liberated from its host. You hooked your finger into a ring, gave a vigorous tug, and were suddenly in possession of a jagged, curled ribbon of metal that possessed the structural integrity of a razor blade and the moral character of a pirate. What did the American citizen do with this unwanted shrapnel? He did what every red-blooded son of the Republic did in an era of boundless optimism and cheap gasoline. He threw it on the ground. He threw it into the tall grass. He buried it in the sand of the beach. He dropped it into the crystal-clear waters of the mountain stream. He scattered these little metal boomerangs across the continent with the lavish generosity of a king scattering gold coins to a crowd, oblivious to the fact that he was essentially seeding the earth with millions of tiny, silver-colored landmines. I recall a summer afternoon on the banks of the Mississippi, watching a gentleman of otherwise impeccable character enjoy a cold soda. With a flick of his wrist, he sent his pull tab sailing into the river mud. "Why did you do that, Silas?" I inquired. "Do you believe the catfish are in need of jewelry? Or are you merely hoping to provide a future archaeologist with a puzzle that will occupy his mind for a decade?" "It's the American way, Mark," Silas replied, wiping a bead of condensation from his brow. "It's disposable. That's the beauty of it. You use the thing, you lose the thing, and you never have to think about the thing again. It's freedom, pure and simple." It is a peculiar kind of freedom, I noted, that requires the rest of us to walk through the world in ironclad boots to avoid being sliced into ribbons by your liberty rings. By 1975, the aluminum snow had reached the proportions of a national crisis. The beaches of the great republic had become treacherous territories. A simple stroll through the surf was no longer a romantic endeavor. It was an exercise in tactical navigation. The soles of the American foot were in a state of constant quivering retreat. We had become a nation of limpers. We were being defeated by our own thirst, one jagged pull tab at a time. It was in this atmosphere of wounded toes and rising ecological guilt that a gentleman named Daniel F. Coudert working for the Reynolds Metals Company, unleashed the stay-on tab. It was a mechanical masterpiece of restraint. It was a tab that performed the pop, but adamantly refused to participate in the toss. It stayed where it was put, held fast to the can by a sturdy little rivet, like a dog on a short leash. The introduction of this device was met with a level of confusion that would have baffled a philosopher. The American public, having been trained for a generation to rip the head off their beverages, suddenly found themselves in a wrestling match with a piece of metal that wouldn't let go. I observed a fellow in a tavern in Cincinnati who spent the better part of 10 minutes trying to liberate a stay-on tab from his can of ginger ale. He pulled, he twisted, he used a pair of pliers he happened to have in his pocket, and finally he gave a roar of frustration that shook the very rafters. "It's stuck," he cried, holding the mangled can aloft like a captured enemy. "The machinery has failed. I've paid my nickel, and the can is holding the ring hostage. It's an outrage. It's a violation of my constitutional right to litter." "Be calm, friend," I said. "It isn't stuck. It's environmentally conscious. It is designed to stay with the can, so that you might take it to a bin, rather than leaving it in the grass to be discovered by the foot of a passing child." "But it gets in the way of my nose," he protested. "When I tilt the can back, the tab presses against my nostril with the cold indifference of a tax collector's heart. How am I supposed to enjoy my drink with a mechanical thumb pushing on my face?" This was the great psychological hurdle of 1975. We had to learn to drink with our trash. We had to accept that our disposable culture was being replaced by a connected culture, a world where the things we used remained our responsibility even after we were done with them. It was a profound and unsettling shift in the national character. We were being asked to grow up, and we were finding the process remarkably itchy. But oh, the peace that followed. As the stay-on tab took hold, the aluminum snow began to melt away. The beaches became safe for bare feet once more. The sound of the toss, that light metallic clink on the pavement, was replaced by the heavy, muffled silence of a can being placed properly into a receptacle. There is a deeply sleep-inducing quality to this transition. Imagine the quiet of a beach in the late autumn of 1975. The waves are lapping at the shore with a rhythmic, steady pulse. Wash. Shh. In the old days, you would have seen the glint of 1,000 pull tabs reflecting the moonlight, each one a tiny threat waiting in the dark. But tonight, the sand is smooth. It is a vast, uninterrupted blanket of pale gold. The metal ghosts have been laid to rest. Think of the stay-on tab itself. It is a study in stillness. It doesn't want to go anywhere. It is content to stay exactly where it was born, resting against the top of the can like a tired traveler leaning against a wall. It has done its job. It has opened the door, and now it is happy to just be part of the furniture. As you settle into your blankets, imagine that you are a stay-on tab. You aren't being pulled. You aren't being tossed. You are securely riveted to your own little corner of the world. The pop of the day's activities is over. The pressure has been released. The aluminum snow of your worries, all those jagged little thoughts that usually cut into your peace of mind, has been gathered up and put away. The world is no longer a place of sharp edges and discarded remnants. It is a world of connections, where everything is held firmly in place by a divine and benevolent rivet. You don't have to worry about where you're going, because you aren't going anywhere. You are staying on. You are resting. The night is cool, the sand is soft, and the only thing popping is the occasional bubble of a dream in the back of your mind. The Republic is safe, the toes of the nation are healing, and the trash is exactly where it belongs. Good night, Mr. Coudert. Good night, Reynolds Metals. Good night to the jagged rings of the past. The snow has stopped falling, the ground is clear, and the silence of the stay-on tab is the sweetest lullaby a weary traveler could ask for. Next chapter, The Tragedy of the Leisure Suit. An inquiry into why the human race decided to dress like upholstered patio furniture and the subsequent moral decay of the neighborhood disco. Chapter 7. The Wheel of Fortune Turns. It has been a long-standing theory of mine that the American public, when presented with the opportunity to exert itself for the common good, will generally prefer to take a nap. But when presented with the opportunity to watch a wooden wheel spin in a circle for the chance to win a mahogany hat rack, they will exhibit an energy that would put a steam turbine to shame. In the early days of the year 1975, a gentleman by the name of Merv Griffin, a man whose primary contribution to civilization was the realization that people enjoy watching other people struggle to remember the alphabet, unleashed upon the airwaves a spectacle known as Wheel of Fortune. Now, the game show is a peculiar American institution. It is a secular temple where we worship at the altar of something for nothing. It is the only place on earth where a man can be publicly rewarded for knowing that the letter T often follows the letter S, a piece of information that in any other context would merely suggest he had completed the 3rd grade. But in the mid-70s, we were a nation in dire need of a distraction that required no heavy lifting of the intellect. We had been through wars, we had been through political scandals, and we were currently wearing suits made of recycled milk jugs. We were, quite frankly, ready to shout at a wall. The premise of the wheel was deceptively simple, which is the hallmark of all truly successful traps. 3 contestants, usually dressed in the pastel finery of the era, which meant the men looked like overripe melons and the women like explodes of chiffon, would stand behind a podium and take turns spinning a giant multicolored wheel. The sound of that wheel is one of the great hypnotic rhythms of the 20th century. It is a rhythmic click, 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 click that sounds like a very industrious woodpecker trying to find a worm in a telegraph pole. For the weary traveler of 1975, this sound was a sedative of the highest order. It was the sound of fate being decided by a ball bearing and a bit of grease. Big money! Big money! The contestants would hoot, leaning over the wheel as if they were trying to coax a stubborn mule up a hill. And what was this big money? In 1975, it was often a few $100s, which in those days was enough to buy a very respectable used car or perhaps a single square yard of high-quality shag carpeting. But the money was merely a means to an end. The true genius of the original Wheel of Fortune, and the part that I find most indicative of the era's polite insanity, was the shopping. You see, in those days, if you were clever enough to realize that the phrase on the board was a stick in the mud, you didn't just walk away with a check. No, you were forced, under the watchful eye of the host, Mr. Chuck Woolery, to go shopping in a simulated living room that looked like a warehouse for things that no sane person would ever buy with their own money. Imagine, if you will, a man from a small town in Nebraska who has just won $1,200 by guessing that N was a prominent feature of the word banana. He is then presented with a revolving stage full of treasures. There are brass floor lamps that look like they belong in a Victorian funeral parlor. There are his and hers luggage sets made of a material that resembles the skin of a prehistoric lizard. There are cedar hot tubs, which were the height of 1975 luxury, promising the owner the chance to sit in warm water with 3 of his neighbors while smelling like a pencil sharpener. And then there was the Dalmatian. Every episode seemed to feature a ceramic Dalmatian. It was a life-size dog made of shiny porcelain, frozen in a state of eternal spotted alertness. It cost roughly $150 in wheel money. I have often sat in the twilight and wondered about the fate of those porcelain hounds. Somewhere in the vast expanse of the American suburbs, there are thousands of these dogs, still guarding the foyers of houses where the wallpaper has turned yellow, and the leisure suits have long since been donated to charity. They are the silent witnesses to a time when we thought a ceramic canine was a fair trade for our dignity. The host, Chuck Woolery, was a man of remarkable composure. He possessed a smile that was so bright and so constant that I suspect it was powered by a hidden battery in his pocket. He was famous for his 2 and 2 sign, telling the audience he would be back in 2 minutes and 2 seconds, as if the extra 2 seconds were a gift of such immense value that we should all be eternally grateful. He presided over the proceedings with the easy grace of a man who knew that his job was to stand next to a turning wheel and try not to get his tie caught in the machinery. Beside him stood Susan Stafford, the original mistress of the letters. Her task was to walk back and forth in front of a giant wall of blocks and turn them over when a contestant guessed correctly. It was a job that required the stamina of a marathon runner and the poise of a ballerina. She spent her days turning R's and S's, providing the visual evidence that the alphabet was still functioning. It was a quiet, dignified labor, much like the work of a lighthouse keeper, but with better shoes and more sequins. The puzzles themselves were a marvel of the mundane. They were never the theory of relativity or the critique of pure reason. They were things like a pot to cook in or whistling in the dark. They were phrases that occupied the dusty corners of the American mind. Watching a contestant struggle to find the L in hello was a form of national therapy. It reminded us that no matter how complicated the world became, we still knew our letters, most of the time. I recall a lady who was so overcome by the excitement of the wheel that she forgot her own name, but managed to guess that the mystery phrase was "practice makes perfect." When she won, she spent her earnings on a set of gold-plated fondue forks and a year's supply of turtle wax. "What will you do with the turtle wax, Mary?" Mr. Woolery asked, his smile glowing like a lighthouse. "I don't have a car, Chuck," she replied, "but I'm going to wax my linoleum until I can see my face in it." That was the spirit of 1975. We didn't need a car. We just needed a shine. The bankrupt space on the wheel was the great villain of the piece. It was a black wedge that represented the cold hand of reality. You could have $3,000 in your account, enough to buy the hot tub and the ceramic dog, and with one unlucky flick of the wrist, it was all gone. The audience would groan with a sound like a sinking ship, and the contestant would look at the wheel with the betrayal of a lover who has just discovered their paramour is a professional thief. But the wheel kept turning. It always kept turning. As you close your eyes now, I want you to hear that sound. Click, 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 click. It is the most relaxing sound in the world. It is the sound of nothing being at stake. It is the sound of a ceramic dog waiting for a home. The lights of the studio are bright, but they are far away. The applause of the audience is a soft, muffled thunder, like rain on a tin roof. Imagine you are the one at the wheel. You don't have to guess any letters. You don't have to buy a mahogany hat rack. You can just watch the colors spin. The orange of the free spin, the yellow of the $500, the black of the bankrupt. They all blur together into a gentle, swirling whirlpool of pastel ink. The wheel is slowing down now. The clicks are getting further apart. Click, ah, click, ah, click. The stage is quiet. Chuck has given his 2 and 2 and gone home to bed. Susan has turned the last letter, and the board is blank. The ceramic Dalmatian is tucked away in the shadows, its porcelain eyes closed. You are safe in your own living room, far from the shopping room and the mahogany bars. The year 1975 was a long game of chance, and we were all just spinning our wheels hoping for a prize. But tonight, the prize is just the silence. The wheel has stopped on a space that isn't on the board, a deep, dark space of dreamless sleep. No vowels required. Good night, Chuck. Good night, Susan. Good night to all the shoppers in the dark. Chapter 8. The Fall of Saigon and the Rise of Confusion. It has often been my private suspicion that history is not a deliberate march of grand ideals, but rather a series of very large misunderstandings conducted by gentlemen in very small rooms. When we look upon the records of our race, we are told of manifest destiny, of strategic interests, and of the balance of power. But if you look closely between the lines, you will generally find a collection of bewildered souls wondering where they left their hats and how they managed to get into such a prodigious scrape in the first place. In the spring of the year 1975, the United States of America decided, with a collective and audible sigh of exhaustion, that it was finally time to leave the jungles of Southeast Asia and return to the much more pressing business of figuring out how to work a microwave oven. The conflict in Vietnam had been, for many years, a police action, a term which I find to be one of the most exquisite pieces of linguistic embroidery ever devised. To call a 20-year struggle involving millions of men, enough high explosives to remodel the moon, and a distinct lack of any actual police and action, is to treat a cataclysm like a mere stroll to the post office. By 1975, however, even the most enthusiastic embroiderers in Washington had run out of thread. The peace with honor that had been promised a few years earlier had turned out to be departure with alacrity, and the American public was more than ready to let the curtain fall on a play that had gone on for 6 acts too many. In April of that year, the city of Saigon, the Pearl of the Orient, as the travel brochures used to say before they were replaced by tactical maps, became the stage for the most spectacular moving-out sale in human history. It was a moment of such profound confusion that even the pigeons in the square seemed to be looking for a way out. The North Vietnamese army was approaching with the steady, unblinking resolve of a landlord coming to collect 20 years of back rent, and the American presence was evaporating like a dewdrop in a furnace. The image that remains etched upon the glass of our national memory is that of the helicopter on the roof of the embassy. Now, a helicopter is a marvelous invention. It is a collection of several thousand vibrating parts, all of which are trying to fly in different directions, held together by the sheer force of human stubbornness. To see one perched on a tiny roof with a line of people stretching down the stairs like shoppers waiting for a midnight sale at a dry goods store is to witness the true nature of strategic withdrawal. It wasn't a retreat so much as it was a very crowded elevator ride to nowhere in particular. There was a frantic, almost slapstick energy to the proceedings. On the decks of the aircraft carriers off the coast, the sailors were engaged in a form of maritime spring cleaning that would have shocked a New England housewife. Because there was no more room on the decks for the incoming helicopters, they simply pushed the old ones into the sea. I can think of no more perfect symbol for 1975 than a multi-million-dollar machine being tipped into the salt water with a heave-ho and a splash, simply because we had nowhere else to put it. It was the ultimate gesture of a nation that was done. We were throwing our toys out of the bathtub and going to bed. Back home, the American people watched this spectacle on their evening news with a feeling that can only be described as rise of confusion. We had been told for a generation that if a certain set of dominoes fell in a certain jungle, the entire world would promptly collapse into a heap of socialist misery. Yet, as the dominoes finally toppled over with a resounding thud, the world did not collapse. The sun continued to rise, the mail continued to be late, and the price of eggs continued to be an outrage. The great confusion of 1975 was the realization that we had no idea what we were doing, why we had done it, or what we were supposed to do next. We had spent 2 decades worrying about the spread of communism, only to find that we were much more concerned about the spread of shag carpeting. We had traded our bayonets for croquet mallets and our uniforms for the aforementioned polyester leisure suits, and we found that the transition left us with a strange, hollow ringing in our ears. I recall speaking to a veteran of the State Department, a man whose skin had the texture of an old law book and whose eyes were perpetually narrowed as if he were trying to read the fine print on a soul. "What does it mean, Mark?" he asked me, staring into the bottom of a glass of bourbon that had seen better days. "We spent billions. We lost thousands. And now they're just there. And we're here. What was the point of the whole exercise?" "The point," I replied, "is that man is the only animal that can convince himself that a hole in the ground is a palace, provided he spends enough money digging it. We have finished the hole, and now we are surprised to find that it is dark and damp inside. The point is that we are going home to take a nap, and we are going to pretend the last 20 years were a particularly vivid dream brought on by an excess of spicy pickles." He nodded, a slow, rhythmic movement that suggested he was already halfway to that nap. "A national nap," he whispered. "That sounds about right. I think I'll start mine early." And that, truly, was the spirit of the hour. 1975 was the year the United States put on its pajamas. We were tired of the big questions. We didn't want to hear about the crusade for freedom or the global struggle. We wanted to hear about things that were small, quiet, and entirely unimportant. We wanted to talk about the weather. We wanted to watch game shows. And we wanted to worry about whether our pet rocks were getting enough exercise. The fall of Saigon was the slamming of a very heavy door. Behind it lay the ghosts of 1,000 mistakes, and in front of it lay a long beige hallway of domesticity. We walked into that hallway, turned off the lights, and crawled under the covers. The confusion was not a painful thing. It was a soft, fuzzy blanket. It was the realization that if we didn't understand the world couldn't expect anything from us. As you drift off now, imagine the sound of those helicopters, not as the roar of engines, but as the rhythmic, distant thrum of a ceiling fan in a summer parlor. Imagine the jungle turning into a garden, and the garden turning into a quiet room. The maps are being folded up. The generals are taking off their boots. The diplomats are closing their ledgers. The war is over, not because anyone won, but because everyone was too sleepy to keep the score. The dominoes have all fallen over, and it turns out they make a very comfortable bed. The Mekong River is far away, and the Mississippi is quiet. There is no more news at 11. There is only the soft, steady breathing of a nation that has finally stopped trying to save the world and has decided to save its own strength for the morning. The rise of confusion is just another way of saying that the lights are out and we are no longer sure where the furniture is. But that's all right. You don't need to see the chair to sit in it, and you don't need to understand the world to sleep in it. Good night, Saigon. Good night, Washington. Good night to the helicopters in the sea. The water is deep, the night is long, and the confusion is as soft as a pillow. Chapter 9. The New York City Fire Sale. It is a well-documented fact that the difference between a pauper and a prince is merely a matter of a few zeros and the particular shade of ink used by his banker. When a man owes $100, he is a wretch who must hide from the landlord and survive on the steam from the bakery vent. But when a city owes several billion dollars, it is a financial crisis, a term of such gravity and elegance that it suggests the city has not so much run out of money as it has entered a more sophisticated state of existence. In the autumn of the year 1975, New York City, the Empire City, the jewel of the Hudson, the place so nice they named it twice, found itself in the position of a grand duchess who has spent her last nickel on a hat and is now forced to ask the local blacksmith for a loan to cover the rent on her palace. New York had for many years been living with the cheerful abandon of a sailor on shore leave with a pocket full of gold. It had built subways that stretched to the horizon, schools that rivaled the academies of old, and a bureaucracy so vast and intricate that it was rumored there were departments dedicated solely to the study of other departments. The city was a magnificent machine for spending money it hadn't yet earned, fueled by the unshakable belief that tomorrow would always bring a fresh crop of taxpayers and a new harvest of municipal bonds. But in 1975, tomorrow arrived, and it brought nothing but a collection of very polite, very firm gentlemen from the banks who wished to know when they might see their principal. The mayor of New York at the time was a gentleman named Abraham Beam. Now, Mr. Beam was a man of modest stature and a professional background in accounting. He was a man who understood the majesty of the ledger and the sanctity of the double-entry system. To see a career accountant presiding over a city that was bleeding cash like a stuck hog was a spectacle of exquisite irony. It was as if a librarian had been asked to command a pirate ship in the middle of a hurricane. Mr. Beam looked at the numbers, adjusted his spectacles, and realized that the city was not merely broke, but was in fact operating on a level of debt that defied the laws of mathematics. He did what any sensible man in such a predicament would do. He went to Washington, D.C. to see the president. Gerald Ford, as we have previously established, was a man of sturdy Midwestern virtues and a somewhat tenuous relationship with the stairs of his own airplane. He looked upon the plight of New York City with the cold, unblinking eye of a banker from Grand Rapids. To Mr. Ford, a city that couldn't pay its bills was like a neighbor who had spent his mortgage money on fireworks and was now asking for a handout to fix the roof. The meeting between the mayor and the president was a study in contrasts. On one side, you had the representative of the old world, the gritty, bustling, spendthrift metropolis that believed the federal government was a bottomless well of charity. On the other side, you had the representative of fiscal responsibility, a man who believed that if you couldn't afford the silk, you should be happy with the sackcloth. The president's answer to the city's plea for a bailout was a resounding, spectacular, and utterly polite no. The following morning, the New York Daily News, a publication that has never let the truth get in the way of a good 6-inch tall headline, summarized the president's position with the immortal phrase, "Ford to city, drop dead." Now, to be fair to Mr. Ford, he had never actually used those specific words. He had given a long and somewhat tedious speech about vetoing any bill that would provide a federal guarantee of New York's municipal bonds, which is the sort of thing that makes a man's eyes glaze over and his chin hit his chest. But the Daily News understood that the American public does not read speeches. It reads insults. By boiling down several hours of economic theory into 3 syllables of urban aggression, they turned a budget dispute into a blood feud. The reaction in New York was one of magnificent wounded pride. The citizens of the city, who are accustomed to being hated by the rest of the country and generally find it a mark of distinction, were suddenly faced with the prospect of their home being repossessed. There were rumors that the garbage would stop being collected, that the subways would be sold for scrap metal, and that the Statue of Liberty might be auctioned off to a used car dealer in New Jersey. I recall speaking to a cab driver during this period, a man who had survived 4 wars, 3 marriages, and the invention of the automated toll booth. "Drop dead, eh?" he growled, swerving to avoid a pothole that was large enough to contain a modest-sized piano. "Let 'em try to close us down. Who's going to pay the bills then? If New York stops, the world stops. We're the engine mark. D.C. is just the hood ornament." "That may be true," I replied, "but even the finest engine will seize up if it runs out of oil. And currently, your oil is being held hostage by a man who thinks New York is just a very large, very expensive mistake." "We'll find the money," the driver said, with the grim determination of a gambler on his last hand. "We'll sell the bridges. We'll charge the pigeons for their purchase. We'll put a tax on breathing. We're New Yorkers. We've been broke before, and we'll be broke again. But we'll do it with style." And find the money they did. Sort of. The city entered a period of austerity, another wonderful word that sounds like a religious vow, but actually means that the streets aren't swept and the libraries are closed on Tuesdays. The teachers, the firemen, and the policemen, the very people who kept the city from descending into a state of nature, were told that their pensions were now investments in the city's survival. It was a fire sale where the citizens themselves were the merchandise. But as the crisis deepened, a strange thing happened. The city didn't drop dead. Instead, it discovered a reserves of grit and humor that had been buried under years of prosperity. People started to realize that if the government wouldn't save them, they would have to save themselves. They held Big Apple rallies. They wore buttons that said, "I love New York." And they began to treat the bankruptcy as a shared adventure, like a shipwreck where everyone is trying to build a raft out of the piano lids. The irony of the New York fire sale was that it happened in the same year that we were celebrating the birth of the nation. We were getting ready for the bicentennial, painting our hydrants red, white, and blue, while our greatest city was checking the cushions of the sofa for spare change. It was a reminder that the American dream is often accompanied by a very large American bill. As you drift off tonight, I want you to imagine the city of New York in the twilight of 1975. The lights of Broadway are still shining, though perhaps a few bulbs are burned out to save on the electric bill. The subways are still rumbling through the dark, carrying the weary and the hopeful to their beds. The skyscrapers stand like silent sentinels, tall and proud and deeply in debt. Imagine the silence of the counting houses. The ledgers are closed. The accountants have gone home. The financial crisis is put to bed for the night. The city is a vast, slumbering giant, dreaming of a balanced budget and a president who might one day say something more encouraging than drop dead. There is a peace in being broke. When you have nothing left to lose, you have nothing left to worry about. The fire sale is over for the evening. The sirens are distant, the harbor is quiet, and the Empire State Building is just a long shadow in the moonlight. Good night, Mr. Beam. Good night, Mr. Ford. Good night to the city that never sleeps, but which, for tonight, is at least resting its eyes while it waits for the check to clear. Chapter 10. The Apollo-Soyuz Handshake. It has been my long-standing conviction that if you wish to see the human race at its most agreeable, you must first remove it from the presence of oxygen. Down here on the terra firma, where the air is thick and the taxes are high, we spend the better part of our days finding inventive reasons to disagree with our neighbors over the placement of a fence, the interpretation of a scripture, or the particular shade of a political banner. But take two men, strap them into metal canisters that have the structural integrity of a soup tin, and hurl them some 140 miles into the silent, freezing vacuum of the heavens, and suddenly they become the very models of Christian charity and international brotherhood. In the July of 1975, the world witnessed a spectacle that was as magnificent as it was entirely improbable. It was called the Apollo-Soyuz Test Project, a title designed by a committee of bureaucrats to ensure that no one would accidentally find it exciting. But beneath that dry-as-dust name lay a story that would have made a romantic novelist weep into his inkwell. It was the story of the great celestial handshake, the moment when the American eagle and the Russian bear decided to stop growling at one another across the Bering Strait and instead meet for a quiet cup of tea in the middle of a vacuum. For 20 years, the United States and the Soviet Union had been engaged in what we called the space race, a prodigious contest to see who could throw a larger rock higher into the air. We spent billions of dollars, employed armies of men in white coats, and built computers that took up entire buildings just to prove that our brand of physics was more patriotic than theirs. We went to the moon, they stayed in orbit, and we both glared at each other from our respective porches, wondering who would be the first to invent a way to colonize Mars and put a billboard on it. But by 1975, both nations were feeling a bit winded. We had the aforementioned rise of confusion back home, and the Soviets had a wheat crop that was behaving with a remarkable lack of enthusiasm. It was decided in the quiet halls of diplomacy that perhaps it was time for a détente, another one of those elegant French words that means we are currently too broke to keep fighting, so let's pretend we like each other for a while. The plan was simple in theory and terrifying in practice. We would launch an Apollo capsule from Florida. They would launch a Soyuz capsule from the plains of Kazakhstan, and they would meet in the dark, lonely expanse of orbit to perform a docking. Now, docking in space is not like docking a ferry at the pier. In space, there is no pier, there is no water, and if you miss by half an inch, you do not merely scuff the paint. You turn your multi-million-dollar spacecraft into a collection of very expensive confetti. To make matters worse, the two spacecraft were built on entirely different principles. The Americans used one kind of air, the Russians used another. We used inches and feet. They used meters and centimeters. We liked our coffee with cream, and they, I suspect, preferred their tea with a side of historical inevitability. To bridge this gap, we had to build a docking module, a sort of mechanical handshake that allowed the two ships to join together without causing a catastrophic explosion. It was a marvel of engineering, a metal tunnel that served as a neutral ground, a celestial parlor where two weary travelers could meet and exchange pleasantries. The Americans were led by Thomas Stafford, a gentleman from Oklahoma with a voice that sounded like a slow-moving river of molasses. The Russians were led by Alexei Leonov, a hero of the Soviet Union who had once taken a stroll in space and found it much to his liking. The moment of the docking was a triumph of human patience. For hours, the two ships maneuvered around each other like two shy dancers at a country social. Then, with a gentle clunk that was heard round the world, or at least imagined by it, the latch was thrown. The hatch opened, and there, suspended over the Atlantic Ocean, Thomas Stafford reached out his hand, and Alexei Leonov took it. "I'm glad to see you," Stafford said, in a Russian that was heavily seasoned with the dust of the Oklahoma plains. "Very glad to see you, too," Leonov replied, in an English that sounded like a symphony played on a balalaika. It was a singular moment. For a few minutes, the Cold War ceased to exist. There were no borders, no ideologies, no strategic nuclear missiles, just two middle-aged men in jumpsuits, floating in a tin can, trying to remember which way was up. They spent 2 days together, and their activities were a testament to the charming triviality of the human spirit. They exchanged gifts, flags, commemorative plaques, and packets of tree seeds that were destined to grow into space trees back on Earth. They ate together, though eating in space is a process that involves squeezing lukewarm paste out of a tube, a culinary experience that I imagine is not unlike eating a tube of toothpaste that has been flavored with the memory of a ham sandwich. Leonov, being a man of great wit, even played a prank on the Americans. He presented them with tubes labeled vodka, which in the Soviet Union is considered a basic human right, like breathing or complaining about the winter. The Americans, being under strict orders to remain sober while operating heavy machinery in a vacuum, were momentarily paralyzed with diplomatic panic. When they finally opened the tubes, they found not vodka, but a very fine Russian borscht. In space, Leonov laughed. The soup is the only thing that has any spirit. There is something profoundly sleep-inducing about the thought of that mission. Imagine the silence of the capsules. There is no wind in space, no birdsong, no traffic, no shouting of headlines. There is only the steady rhythmic hum of the life support systems, a sound like a distant hive of bees. The two ships, locked together, drifted over the continents like a single peaceful thought. They saw the earth as it truly is, a small blue marble, remarkably fragile and entirely devoid of the lines we draw on our maps. "You know, Alexei," Stafford reportedly said as they looked out the window, "it's hard to see the problems of New York City from up here." "It is hard to see any problems," Leonov agreed. "From here, it all looks like a very good place for a nap." And so it was. The Apollo-Soyuz mission was the final act of the Apollo era, a graceful bow before the curtain fell on the first great age of space exploration. We had proven that we could find each other in the dark. We had proven that a man from Oklahoma and a man from Siberia could share a tube of beet soup without starting a revolution. As you settle into your pillows tonight, let your mind drift upward, past the roof of your house, past the clouds, and into that high, quiet orbit. Imagine those two ships docked together in the starlight. There is no us and them up there. There is only the we of a species that is much better at being friends when it's too busy trying not to fall into the sun. The hatch is closed now. The docking module has been jettisoned. The American ship is splashing down in the Pacific, and the Russian ship is settling into the dust of the steppe. The astronauts are back on Earth, being poked by doctors and interviewed by reporters, and they are likely missing the quiet of the void. But you, my friend, are already there. The room is still. The gravity is holding you gently in its arms. The stars are looking down, and they don't care about your bank account or your leisure suit. They only care that you are quiet and that you are safe and that for one night the world is at peace. Good night, Alexei. Good night, Tom. The handshake is over, the soup is finished, and the sky is a velvet blanket that covers us all. Chapter 11. The birth of the Saturday night fever. It has always been my private contention that the hours between midnight and dawn were intended by the Creator for the quiet contemplation of one's sins, or failing that, a very thorough and uninterrupted bout of snoring. For centuries, the human race respected this arrangement, recognizing that after the sun goes down and the chickens have retired, there is very little a man can do that won't result in a headache or a lawsuit. But in the year of our Lord 1975, the National Broadcasting Company decided that the American public was entirely too well rested. They looked upon the sleeping nation and said, "What these people need is not a pillow, but a group of lunatics in bee costumes." Thus was born Saturday Night Live, or as it was known in its infancy, a rebellion in grease paint. led by a group of youths who called themselves the Not Ready for Prime Time Players. Now, the very title of their troupe is a masterpiece of honesty. In 1975, prime time was the sacred ground of television, a place inhabited by men with perfectly symmetrical hair, and women who seemed to have been born wearing a full set of pearls. To be not ready for this was a badge of honor. It suggested that you were too loud, too honest, or perhaps too likely to catch fire on live television to be trusted with the dinner hour. The ringleader of this circus was a young Canadian by the name of Lorne Michaels, a man who possessed the quiet, watchful eyes of a card sharp and the patience of a saint who has decided to manage an asylum. He gathered a collection of misfits from the dark corners of improvisational theaters and told them that they were going to stay up late and mock everything that America held dear, including the president, the news, and the very commercials that paid their salaries. The first broadcast occurred in October, hosted by George Carlin, a man whose hair was as wild as his vocabulary. It was a chaotic, shimmering mess of a program. It didn't have the polished plastic sheen of a variety show. It had the frantic energy of a kitchen fire. There were sketches that didn't quite end, jokes that required a degree in sociology to understand, and a general sense that at any moment the police might burst in and arrest everyone for disturbing the peace of the airwaves. Among the players was a gentleman named John Belushi, a man who possessed the physical presence of a hurricane and the delicate comedic touch of a falling piano. To watch Belushi on screen was to witness a man who had decided that the laws of physics were merely suggestions. He did not act so much as he exploded, whether he was playing a samurai who worked as a deli clerk or simply staring at the camera with an intensity that could melt lead. He reminded us that there is a certain kind of genius that only thrives after 12 o'clock. Then there was Gilda Radner, a creature of such immense and joyful absurdity that she could make the simple act of reading the news as Rosanna Dana feel like a religious experience. She reminded us that the world is a messy, itchy, complicated place, and that the only sane response is to put on a wig and shout about it. And of course, we must return briefly to our friend Chevy Chase. As we discussed in our inquiry into the trials of President Ford, Mr. Chase made a very fine living out of the simple act of falling down. Every week, he would walk to a podium, announce that I'm Chevy Chase and you're not, and then promptly disappear behind the desk in a tangle of limbs. It was a simple joke, but it spoke to the very heart of 1975. We were a nation that had been told we were the greatest on earth, yet we kept tripping over the rug. By watching a handsome young man fall down on purpose, we felt a little better about falling down by accident. The most revolutionary aspect of the show, however, was the weekend update. For decades, the American public had treated the nightly news with the same reverence they afforded the Sunday sermon. Men like Walter Cronkite were the high priests of reality, telling us the way it is, with a gravitas that suggested they were reading directly from the tablets of Moses. Saturday Night Live took this sacred institution and turned it into a funhouse mirror. They realized that the news in 1975 was so ridiculous, what with the pet rocks, the leisure suits, and the presidents who couldn't find their own feet, that the only way to report it was to laugh. They proved that the truth is often much funnier than fiction and significantly easier to digest when accompanied by a deadpan delivery and a well-timed eye roll. I recall a conversation I had with a gentleman who had spent 30 years as a night watchman at a warehouse. He was a man who knew the secrets of the dark, and he was an early convert to the cult of Saturday night. "It's the first time the television has ever talked back to me," he said, leaning against a crate of industrial fan belts. "Usually the box tells me that everything is fine, that my breath could be fresher, and that I should buy a station wagon. But these kids, they tell me the world is a madhouse, and since I spend my nights watching a warehouse that contains nothing but air and dust, I happen to agree with them. It is a patriotic duty to stay up and watch them," he continued, "because if we all go to sleep, who's going to notice when the world finally loses its mind entirely?" This was the Saturday night fever of the mind. It wasn't about the dancing. That would come later with the white suits and the disco balls. It was about the feverish realization that we were allowed to be irreverent. We were allowed to stay up late, eat cold pizza, and watch people act like fools. It was a national nightlight for a country that was afraid of the dark. There is a profound, sleep-inducing quality to this kind of comedy. It is the laughter of relief. When you laugh at the absurdity of the world loses its power to keep you awake with worry. If the news is a joke, you don't have to stay up and solve it. You can simply turn off the set, crawl under your polyester blend sheets, and realize that the sun will come up tomorrow, whether or not the land shark has been apprehended. Imagine the studio now, in the silence that follows the good night and the final notes of the saxophone. The lights are being dimmed. The set of the update desk is being wheeled into the shadows. The bee costumes are being hung up in a closet. The not ready for prime time players are heading out into the New York night, perhaps to find a late-night diner where they can argue about which sketch failed the most spectacularly. The city outside is quiet, save for the occasional honk of a taxi. The millions of people who stayed up to watch have finally clicked off their dials. The tubes in the televisions are cooling down, making that faint, metallic tink-tink sound as they shrink. You are one of those people now. You have done your duty. You have seen the folly, you have heard the jokes, and you have realized that the world is in very capable, very ridiculous hands. The fever has broken, and in its place is a cool, calm sense of exhaustion. The year 1975 was a long, strange Saturday night, and we were all just waiting for the punchline. But tonight, the punchline is a whisper. The screen is a blank, gray void. The house is still. You don't have to be ready for anything, not for prime time, not for the news, not for the morning. You only have to be ready for the pillows. Good night, Lorne. Good night, Gilda. Good night to the land shark, wherever he may be swimming. The show is over, and the rest of the world is just a rerun. Chapter 12. The Mystery of the Missing Hoffa. It has been my long-standing observation that it is a far more difficult feat to remain found in this world than it is to become lost. A man may spend his entire life building a reputation, a fortune, and a collection of enemies, only to find that the moment he steps behind a large shrub to tie his shoelace, the world is perfectly capable of moving on without him, as if he had never existed at all. However, it takes a particular kind of genius, or a particular kind of professional discourtesy, to make a man of Jimmy Hoffa's considerable volume of voice vanish as thoroughly as a politician's promise after an election. In the heat of late July in the year 1975, the United States was presented with its greatest "Where is he?" puzzle since the invention of the Witness Protection Program. James Riddle Hoffa, a middle name that suggests his parents possessed a prophetic sense of humor, was a man who had spent his life at the helm of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. Now, a Union leader of that era was a singular breed of cat. He was a man who spoke for the workers, fought for the drivers, and occasionally engaged in delicate negotiations with gentlemen whose primary interest in labor involved the heavy lifting of concrete blocks and the quiet disposal of inconvenient witnesses. Hoffa was a man of the people, provided the people were behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler and were current on their dues. He was a man who knew where the bodies were buried, right up until the moment he became one of the bodies whose location was a matter of national debate. The scene of the disappearance was a restaurant in Bloomfield Township, Michigan, bearing the delightfully storybook name of the Machias Red Fox. It sounds like the sort of place where one might go to enjoy a quiet plate of liver and onions while discussing the merits of a new tractor. But for Jimmy Hoffa, it was the stage for a vanishing act that would have made Harry Houdini look like a mere amateur playing with a deck of cards. Hoffa had gone to the Red Fox to meet with two associates, a term which, in 1975, was often a polite synonym for people you wouldn't want to meet in a dark alley, even if you were armed with a cannon. These were men with names like Tony Pro and Tony Jack, because in the colorful tapestry of the mid-70s underworld, if your name wasn't Tony, you were essentially an interloper. He waited. He made a phone call to his wife from a hardware store nearby, complaining that he had been stood up. He was annoyed. He was impatient. He was a man who did not like to be kept waiting by anyone, let alone a couple of Tonys. He returned to the parking lot of the Red Fox, and then, with the suddenness of a lightning strike on a clear day, Jimmy Hoffa ceased to be a physical presence and became a permanent inhabitant of the American imagination. What followed was a spectacle of such prodigious and imaginative futility that it remains one of the crowning glories of our national confusion. The FBI descended upon Michigan with the intensity of a swarm of locusts at a picnic. They interviewed everyone who had ever seen a truck. They searched fields, they searched lakes, and they searched the trunks of 1,000 Lincolns. They found many things: unrelated crimes, forgotten debts, and enough discarded polyester to clothe a small nation. But they did not find Jimmy. This was when the gospel of the theories began to take hold. Since no one knew where Jimmy was, everyone decided they knew exactly where he was. The American public, having already embraced the pet rock and the mood ring, was in a particularly receptive state for a good, solid delusion. The most enduring and poetic of these theories involved the construction of the New York Giants Stadium in the meadowlands of New Jersey. It was whispered in taverns and printed in the more excitable newspapers that Hoffa had been gifted a permanent season ticket by being encased in the concrete of the West End zone. It was a magnificent thought, the idea that every Sunday, as a 300-pound lineman charged across the field, he was actually stomping on the most powerful Union leader in history. It gave the game a certain weight that it had previously lacked. I recall discussing this with a gentleman who worked in the construction trade, a man whose skin was permanently dyed the color of a wet brick, and who spoke in the slow, rhythmic cadence of a cement mixer. "He's in the end zone, Mark," he told me, leaning on a shovel with the air of a philosopher. "I can feel it. When the Giants miss a field goal, it's Jimmy reaching up from the rebar and nudging the ball. He never liked New York, you see. He's a Detroit man. He's spending eternity making sure the Giants never get a clean break." "That is a very elaborate piece of engineering," I replied. "To transport a gentleman all the way from Michigan to New Jersey just to provide a bit of filler for a stadium seems like a terrible waste of gasoline, especially given the current state of the oil embargo." "It ain't about the gas," the man whispered. "It's about the message. And the message is, don't keep the Tonys waiting." Other theories were more industrial. Some said he had been processed through a car compactor and turned into a cube of scrap metal the size of a footstool, eventually becoming part of the fender of a 1976 Ford Fairmont. Others suggested he had been fed into a wood chipper, or dissolved in a vat of acid, or perhaps, and this was my favorite, that he had simply retired to a secret island where he spent his days teaching pet rocks how to organize for better living conditions. The beauty of the missing Hoffa was that it provided a never-ending source of entertainment for a nation that was bored with the news. For years afterward, whenever a new highway was paved or an old warehouse was demolished, the local news crews would show up with shovels and a look of breathless anticipation. "Is this the one?" they would ask, as they dug up a rusty pipe or a suspicious-looking bag of trash. It was a form of national "I Spy." We were looking for a man who had become a ghost, a symbol of an era where everything was disappearing, the gold standard, the sense of decorum, and the belief that a man in a tie was necessarily an honest person. As the year 1975 drew to a close, Jimmy Hoffa was officially declared missing, but in truth, he was more present than ever. He was in the concrete of our imagination. He was in the trunk of our suspicions. He was the patron saint of the unsolved. He reminded us that in the great ledger of life, there are some entries that simply will not balance no matter how many accountants you hire. Now, as you find yourself drifting toward the shores of sleep, consider the peace of being truly, magnificently lost. Imagine the Machius red fox in the quiet of the night. The parking lot is empty. The neon sign is flickering. The Tonys have all gone home to their mothers. Think of Jimmy, wherever he may be. Perhaps he is indeed under the end zone, listening to the muffled roar of a crowd that will never find him. Or perhaps he is just a name on a page, a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside a 1975 Cadillac. The search is over for today. The FBI has put away its maps. The psychics have folded their crystal balls. The concrete has long since hardened, and the world is still. You don't have to look for anything tonight. You don't have to solve the mystery. You can just let the silence of the Meadowlands carry you off. The most successful vanishing act is the one we perform every night. When we close our eyes, we disappear from the world, and the world disappears from us. And for a few hours, we are all as unreachable as Jimmy Hoffa. Good night, Jimmy. Good night, Michigan. The shovel is leaning against the wall, the stadium is dark, and the secret is safe with the stars. Chapter 13. The Viking One, Looking for Neighbors. It has long been a source of quiet amusement to me that man, having found himself utterly unable to live in peace with his neighbor across the street, a man who speaks the same language, pays the same taxes, and possesses the same regrettable fondness for loud Sunday afternoon tuba practice, should suddenly decide that his happiness depends entirely upon finding a neighbor, some 40 million miles away, who likely resembles a damp patch of moss or a particularly uncommunicative pebble. In the August of 1975, the United States, still dusting the polyester lint off its trousers and trying to forget the aforementioned unpleasantness in various corners of the globe, decided to launch a billion-dollar tea kettle into the heavens to see if anyone on the planet Mars was interested in a game of checkers. They called this contraption the Viking One. Now, a Viking, in the historical sense, was a gentleman of robust disposition who traveled by sea to pillage your village and perhaps set fire to your thatched roof. This modern Viking, however, was a spindly, three-legged collection of wires, cameras, and biological ovens that looked less like a conqueror and more like a frightened mechanical spider that had been told it was being sent to a place with no air, no water, and a distinct lack of decent hotels. I have often thought that if the Almighty had intended for us to live on Mars, He would have at least provided a bit of shade and perhaps a post office. But man is a restless creature. He has settled the frontiers, he has dammed the rivers, and he has built cities in places where no sensible coyote would dare to tread. Having run out of deserts on earth to complain about, he turned his gaze to the great red desert in the sky. The launch of the Viking was a spectacle of the highest order. We watched as a Titan rocket, fueled by enough explosive energy to remodel a medium-sized mountain range, lifted our hopes and our tax dollars into the blue. It was a magnificent roar, a sound that suggested that if we couldn't find life on Mars, we were at least going to wake up everyone on the way there. And then, for 11 long months, there was silence. Imagine, if you will, the patience required for such an endeavor. In 1975, we were a people who grew agitated if the toaster took more than 2 minutes to produce a piece of charred bread. We were the generation of instant coffee and ready-to-wear suits. Yet we sent a machine on a journey so vast and so lonely that by the time it arrived, the very people who launched it had probably forgotten where they put the instruction manual. The Viking was not merely going to look at Mars, it was going to touch it. It was equipped with a mechanical arm, a sort of robotic soup ladle, designed to scoop up the Martian soil and drop it into a miniature laboratory. This laboratory was the crown jewel of the mission. Its purpose was to find life. Now, life, to a scientist, is a very specific thing involving carbon, respiration, and a tendency to reproduce without a permit. To the rest of us, life means something that moves, something that makes a noise, or at the very least, something that might be persuaded to buy a subscription to a magazine. We were hoping for cities of crystal. We were hoping for canals filled with exotic wine. We were hoping for little green men who would finally explain how to work the vertical hold on our television sets. What we got was red dirt. When the first pictures came back, a process that involved the machine sending a series of dots and dashes across the void with the speed of a very elderly turtle, the world leaned in. We saw a landscape that looked remarkably like a Nevada mining town that had gone bankrupt in the 1870s and had been neglected ever since. It was a vista of rocks, more rocks, and a horizon that looked like it hadn't seen a rain cloud since the dawn of time. "It's beautiful!" the scientists cried, their eyes moist with professional ecstasy. Look at the iron oxide. Look at the volcanic basalt. It looks like a gravel pit, the American public replied, adjusting the dials on their mood rings. Is that all there is? Is there no one to talk to? Is there not even a stray dog or a cactus? But the Viking was undeterred. It reached out its little arm, scooped up a handful of that ancient dusty soil, and began the biological experiments. This was the most sleep-inducing part of the whole affair, for it involved feeding the Martian dirt a kind of chicken soup of nutrients and waiting to see if the dirt burped. I recall sitting in a barber shop in Hannibal, listening to a man explain the process to anyone who couldn't escape the chair. They're looking for labeled release, he said, waving a pair of shears with alarming enthusiasm. They give the germs a bit of sugar water with a radioactive tag on it. If the germs eat the sugar, they breathe out the gas and the machine clicks. It's like setting a trap for a mouse, but the mouse is invisible and lives in a handful of rust. And what if the mouse doesn't eat the sugar? I asked. Then it means the mouse is dead, the barber said, or it means there was never a mouse to begin with, or it means the mouse is on a diet. It's a very complicated business, science. As it turned out, the Martian dirt did indeed burp. For a few glorious hours, the news wires hummed with the word life. We had found it. The dirt had reacted. We were not alone. We were part of a galactic community. But then the wet blanket of scientific caution was thrown over the fire. It was decided that the reaction wasn't life, but merely a bit of exotic chemistry, a result of the soil being exposed to the harsh ultraviolet light of a sun that didn't have an ozone layer to filter out the nastiness. The dirt wasn't breathing. It was just having a chemical fit because we had poured soup on it. The disappointment was palpable. We had traveled 40 million miles, spent enough money to pave the entire state of Missouri in gold leaf, and all we found was a planet that was essentially a giant airless rust bucket. Mars was not a neighbor. It was a ghost town. There is a certain melancholy in the Viking mission that I find very conducive to rest. Think of that little machine sitting all alone in the red dust of Utopia Planitia. The wind howls around it, a thin, freezing wind that carries no scent of flowers and no sound of voices. The sun is a small, pale coin in a butterscotch sky. Every day, the Viking performs its tasks, clicking its switches, turning its cameras, and sending its lonely reports back to a world that has already moved on to worrying about the bicentennial and the price of disco records. It is the ultimate solitary confinement. The Viking is the only thinking thing on an entire world. It is a monument to the human desire to know, even when there is nothing pleasant to be learned. It reminds us that while we are a species of great curiosity, we are also a species that is very easily bored by a neighbor who doesn't have a good story to tell. As you settle into your blankets tonight, take comfort in the fact that your neighborhood is occupied. There are people next door, there are birds in the trees, and there is a thick, wonderful atmosphere that allows you to breathe without the aid of a pressurized suit. You do not have to wait 11 months for a dot and dash message from your kitchen. You do not have to eat radioactive sugar water to prove you are alive. Imagine the Viking now as the Martian night falls. The temperature drops to a level that would make a polar bear reconsider his life choices. The machine grows still. Its heaters hum quietly, fighting back the cosmic cold. It looks up at a bright blue star in its sky, a star we call Earth, and it wonders in its own mechanical way why we sent it so far away just to look at dirt. The stars are silent. The red dust is still. The great desert is at peace. You are back in your own room where the air is sweet and the gravity is familiar. You have found the only neighbor that truly matters, the quiet of your own heart. Good night, Viking. Good night, Mars. May your rocks stay put and your batteries stay warm. We've seen the neighborhood, and we've decided that for now there's no place like home, even if the neighbor does insist on practicing the tuba. Chapter 14. The Bicentennial Itch. It has been my observation that when a man reaches a certain age, he either becomes a philosopher or a nuisance. And when a nation reaches the venerable age of 200, it apparently decides to celebrate the occasion by painting every stationary object in sight the colors of a bruised cherry and a winter sky. In the year of our Lord 1975, the United States of America was seized by what I can only describe as a bicentennial itch, a peculiar patriotic rash that manifested as an uncontrollable urge to decorate the landscape in a manner that would make a rainbow look like a somber funeral procession. Now, you might recall that the actual birthday of the Republic was not due until 1976. But the American spirit is a restless and impatient thing. We are a people who cannot wait for the kettle to boil without trying to invent a way to make the water hotter faster. And so we decided that the year preceding the great anniversary should be spent in a state of pre-celebratory agitation. We did not merely wait for the birthday, we rehearsed it with a fervor that bordered on the religious, turning the entire year of 1975 into a prolonged red, white, and blue dress rehearsal for a play that hadn't even opened yet. The most singular and baffling symptom of this itch was the great fire hydrant transformation. There is something in the American character that venerates the fire hydrant. It is a sturdy, reliable, and humble servant of the public, standing on every corner like a stout little sentinel of safety. Its primary duty, aside from providing water to the brigade, is to serve as a topographical landmark for the neighborhood dogs. But in 1975, the civic authorities decided that the fire hydrant was entirely too plain for a 200-year-old democracy. Throughout the length and breadth of the land, from the rocky coasts of Maine to the dusty plains of Kansas, armies of well-meaning citizens, armed with buckets of enamel and the misguided enthusiasm of a Sunday school picnic, descended upon these iron plugs. They did not merely paint them, they costumed them. They painted them to look like Revolutionary War soldiers, complete with tiny blue coats, white breeches, and little black tricorn hats painted around the nozzle. They gave them faces, determined, stoic, iron-jawed faces that stared out at the passing traffic with a look of metallic dignity. I recall walking through a small town in Missouri, where the local Bicentennial Committee had gone quite mad with the brush. Every hydrant for 6 blocks was a different hero of the Revolution. There was a George Washington hydrant, a Ben Franklin hydrant, and a Paul Revere hydrant that looked as though it were about to shout, "The British are coming!" If only someone would unscrew its cap. "It's a tribute," the committee chairwoman told me, her hand stained a patriotic shade of crimson. "We want the youth of today to recognize their heritage every time they walk the dog." "Madam," I replied, "I fear you are placing an intolerable burden upon the conscience of the local canine population. To ask a simple Labrador to distinguish between a common utility and the father of his country is to invite a level of psychological trauma that no amount of dog biscuits can heal. It is one thing to provide a target for a dog. It is quite another to provide him with a founder. But the itch did not stop at the curbside. It spread to the very bread we ate and the air we breathed. We were suddenly presented with bicentennial bread, which tasted remarkably like the regular bread of 1974, but came in a wrapper adorned with eagles and bells. We had bicentennial toilet paper, which I found to be a particularly dubious way to show one's respect for the Constitution. We had bicentennial gas stations, where the pumps were painted like Liberty Bells, though they still dispensed the same expensive leaded fluid that made the cars of the era cough like a coal miner in a draft. The irony of this spectacle was that it was taking place in a nation that was, as we have noted, currently suffering from a rather severe case of the hiccups. We were in a recession. We were mourning our lost innocence in the jungles. And our greatest city was currently being told to drop dead by the president. Yet, we chose this moment to cover the cracks in the walls with 3-ply patriotic wallpaper. We were like a family that has just lost the mortgage money, but decides to throw the most expensive garden party in the county to keep up appearances. There was a freedom train that began its journey in 1975, a rolling museum filled with the relics of our greatness, George Washington's copy of the Constitution, a moon rock, and, I believe, a pair of Judy Garland slippers. Thousands of people stood in line for hours to shuffle past these treasures, moving with the slow, rhythmic gait of a funeral procession, yet filled with a strange, quiet hope. It was as if, by looking at a piece of old parchment or a dusty rock from space, we could convince ourselves that the chaos of the present was merely a temporary interruption in a grander, more stable story. This is the truly sleep-inducing quality of the bicentennial itch. It provided the nation with a giant, colorful, and entirely harmless hobby. For 1 year, we stopped arguing about the new math and the energy crisis and started arguing about the proper shade of colonial blue. We focused our energies on the trivial, the decorative, and the nostalgic. We wrapped ourselves in the flag, not as a call to arms, but as a warm, quilted comforter. I found that I could spend a very pleasant afternoon just sitting on a porch, watching the neighborhood children try to paint a Spirit of '76 mural on the side of a garage. The rhythmic slap, slap, slap of the brushes, the smell of the turpentine, and the gentle debates over whether Thomas Jefferson had red hair or brown were as soothing as a lullaby. It was a year of home economics on a national scale. We were knitting a sweater for the country, and the repetition of the stitches was enough to make anyone's eyelids grow heavy. Imagine the scene as the sun sets on a Tuesday in July, 1975. The little iron soldiers on the street corners are casting long, patriotic shadows. The freedom train is whistling in the distance, a lonely, mechanical owl hooting at the moon. In a million kitchens, people are eating bicentennial casserole, off plates decorated with pictures of the Mayflower. The paint is drying. That is the fundamental sound of the year, the slow, imperceptible rustle of drying paint. As you lie there now, imagine you have a brush in your hand. You are painting a very small, very unimportant part of history. You aren't worried about the future. You are just focusing on the stroke, left to right, up and down, red, then white, then blue. The colors blur together as you grow tired. The eagle on the bread wrapper closes its eyes. The Liberty Bell stops its silent ringing. The itch has been scratched. We have decorated the parlor. We have polished the silver. And we have dressed the fire hydrants in their Sunday best. Now, there is nothing left to do but wait for the party to start. And the wait is very, very long. The night is cool, and the Republic is safe in its bed of polyester and dreams. The fire hydrants are on guard. The flags are folded, and the shadows of 1776 are dancing gently on the walls of 1975. Good night, George. Good night, Ben. Good night to every little iron soldier in the dark. The paint is dry, the chores are done, and the country is finally, peacefully, fast asleep. Chapter 15. The Microsoft Garage. It has always been my firm and settled understanding that if a man wishes to sell a thing to his neighbor, he ought to have the Christian decency to provide a thing that can be seen, felt, or at the very least, dropped upon one's toe with a satisfying and audible thud. In the simpler days of our ancestors, a merchant sold you a cow, a sack of flour, or a sturdy pair of boots. And if the cow was barren, the flour was full of weevils, or the boots pinched your bunions, you had a tangible object upon which to vent your grievances. But in the year of our Lord 1975, the very nature of property underwent a change so ghostly and suspicious that it would have made a 19th century snake oil salesman blush with envy. In a sun-scorched corner of New Mexico, a place called Albuquerque, which is primarily known for its dust, its distance from anywhere else, and its remarkable ability to make a man feel as though he is living inside a lukewarm kiln. Two young men decided to go into the business of selling software. Now, I invite you to consider that word for a moment. Software. It is a term of such slippery and ethereal character that it sounds like something used to describe the fluff in a Victorian lady's sewing basket. To the sensible mind of 1975, it was a concept as suspect as selling a shadow, or bottling the whistle of a steam locomotive, or charging a nickel for a dream you had about a ham sandwich. It was not the machine itself, that was the hardware, the clunking metal boxes we discussed in our inquiry into the Altair 8800. No, software was the instructions for the machine. It was a list of commands, a series of ifs and thens, that told the metal box how to behave. The young men in question were named Bill Gates and Paul Allen. To look at them in 1975 was to look at two youths who appeared to have been recently expelled from a high school library for an excess of enthusiasm regarding the Dewey Decimal System. They were thin, they were bespectacled, and they possessed that peculiar twitchy energy of people who have forgotten that the sun occasionally sets and that the human body requires more sustenance than cold coffee and the occasional donut. They did not build their empire in a palace or a soaring tower of glass. They started in a garage and a series of cramped rooms surrounded by discarded pizza boxes and the hum of electronics that would have baffled a NASA engineer. They called their fledgling enterprise Microsoft, retaining the hyphen for a time, as if to remind the world that they were small, but they were definitely soft. I have often wondered what their neighbors thought. Imagine a stout, polyester-clad citizen of Albuquerque, perhaps a man who worked in the honest trade of air conditioner repair, looking over his fence at these boys. "What are you boys doing in there?" the neighbor might ask, wiping his brow. "Building a new kind of engine? Inventing a better mousetrap?" "No, sir," young Bill might reply, his eyes shining with a terrifyingly bright intellectual light. "We are writing a version of the basic programming language for an 8080 microprocessor. We are creating a system that allows a human being to communicate with a digital logic gate." The neighbor would likely nod slowly, retreat into his house, and double-lock his doors, convinced that the heat had finally driven the youth of America into a state of incurable polysyllabic madness. The genius, or the grand humbug, depending on your perspective, of the Microsoft venture lay in the fact that they were selling a product that did not actually exist in the physical world. You could not hold a basic interpreter in your hand. You could not use it to prop open a door or level a wobbly table. It was merely a pattern of electrical impulses recorded on a length of paper tape that looked like it had been salvaged from a very small and very busy hole puncher. When Paul Allen flew to Albuquerque to show their work to the men who built the Altair, he realized halfway through the flight that they had forgotten to write the bootstrap loader, the very first set of instructions that told the computer how to read the rest of the tape. Most men would have succumbed to a fit of the vapors or asked the pilot to turn the plane around. But Allen simply took out a pencil and wrote the code right there on the plane, scribbling out the future of civilization on a cocktail napkin or a bit of scrap paper while the clouds drifted by. It is this invisible quality of the work that I find so profoundly sleep-inducing. In the old days, industry was a loud and smoky affair. There were gears grinding, hammers falling, and whistles blowing. You could see the progress. You could smell the grease. But the birth of the computer age was a silent revolution. It happened in the quiet click of a keyboard and the silent flow of electrons. It was an industry of the mind, a labor of pure logic. There is no more certain way to induce a deep and dreamless slumber than to listen to a man explain the intricacies of a do loop or the necessity of a go-to statement. It is a language that bypasses the imagination and goes straight to the part of the brain responsible for hibernation. In 1975, the world was still focused on the hard things, the oil, the steel, the plastic suits. We didn't realize that these two boys in the desert were building a kingdom made of nothing but thought. They were the new alchemists. The old alchemists tried to turn lead into gold, a noble but ultimately futile pursuit. Gates and Allen did something far more impressive. They turned nothing into billions. They realized that in the future, the man who owned the machine would be a servant to the man who wrote the instructions for it. I recall a conversation with a gentleman who had just purchased one of the first Microsoft tapes for his Altair. He was staring at the paper ribbon with a look of profound bewilderment. "It cost me $100, he said, holding the tape as if it were a holy relic. "And if I pull on this end, it just unrolls. It doesn't do anything. It doesn't even glow in the dark." "Ah," I said, "but you aren't buying the paper, my friend. You are buying the idea of the paper. You are buying the ability to tell your blinking box that you are the master, and it the slave. You're buying a piece of a young man's brain, captured in a series of holes." "I think I'd rather have $100 worth of steak," the man replied. "At least I know what to do with a steak." But the world was changing. The garage in Albuquerque was the first crack in the dam of the old world. Soon the invisible would become the most valuable commodity on earth. We were entering an era where a man could become the richest person in history without ever having to lift anything heavier than a mug of coffee. As you settle into your blankets tonight, think of the simplicity of the code. Imagine a long, long line of ones and zeros marching across a screen. 1-0-0-1-1-0. It is a digital sheep-counting exercise for the modern age. You don't need to understand what the numbers mean. No one really does, except perhaps Bill Gates, and even he looks like he could use a good night's rest. The Albuquerque sun has set. The desert is cold. In the small room, the lights of the altar are blinking, and the tape is whirring through the reader. Click, click, click. It is the sound of the future arriving, one bit at a time. It is a quiet sound, a steady sound, a sound that doesn't demand anything of you. The instructions are all written. The ifs have been resolved, and the thens have been satisfied. The program is running in an endless loop, a carousel of logic that will keep spinning until the sun comes up. You are not part of the code. You are the user, and the user is permitted to log off. The screen is fading to black. The hard drive of your mind is spinning down. The software of your dreams is loading now, and it is a much more pleasant program than anything written in 1975. It features no errors, no crashes, and a remarkably high resolution. Good night, Bill. Good night, Paul. The garage is locked, the hyphen is safe, and the world is just a series of blinking lights in the dark. Chapter 16. The One Who Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. I have long harbored the suspicion that the only difference between a lunatic asylum and the United States Congress is that the residents of the former are occasionally required to show some evidence of a conscience, and they generally have better manners at the dinner table. It has been observed by men far more cynical than myself, a feat, I assure you, that is quite difficult to achieve, that the human race is divided into two distinct groups: those who are currently in an institution and those who are merely waiting for the paperwork to be finalized. In the late autumn of the year 1975, a filmmaker named Milos Forman presented the world with a moving picture that suggested the boundary between the two was as thin as the promise of a politician on election eve. The film was titled One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, a name that sounds like a charming nursery rhyme, but in fact heralded a story of such profound and hilarious misery that it became the crowning cinematic achievement of the year. It tells the tale of one Randall Patrick McMurphy, a gentleman of vigorous appetites and a distinct aversion to honest labor, who decides to feign insanity in order to avoid a stint on a prison work farm. It is a classic American gambit. A man will spend 10 times the energy trying to avoid work as he would have spent simply doing the work in the first place, and McMurphy is the patron saint of this industrious laziness. McMurphy, played by young Jack Nicholson, a man who possesses a grin so wide and so perilous that it looks as though his face might eventually split in half and reveal a second, even more mischievous face underneath, arrives at the mental institution convinced that he is the smartest fox in the hen house. He expects a vacation. He expects a bit of cards, a bit of television, and perhaps a comfortable place to nap. while the rest of the world is out digging ditches. But he had not reckoned upon the existence of Nurse Ratched. Now, Nurse Ratched is one of the truly singular villains of our time. She does not breathe fire, she does not carry a trident, and she does not cackle in the moonlight. She is far more terrifying than that. She is a bureaucrat. She is the personification of the system, that cold, unblinking machine that insists that the world must be orderly, that the floors must be polished, and that everyone must take their medication at exactly the same time, regardless of whether they are ill or merely bored. She rules her ward with a soft voice and an iron will, a woman who has replaced her heart with a very efficient filing cabinet. The battle between McMurphy and Ratched was the battle of 1975 in miniature. On one side, you had the spirit of the 60s, rebellious, loud, and inclined to wear its hat at a rakish angle. On the other side, you had the grim reality of the 70s, medicated, institutionalized, and perpetually worried about the rules. We watched McMurphy try to lead his fellow inmates into a state of revolution, and we laughed because his revolution involved such radical acts as wanting to watch the World Series on television. It is a profound commentary on the state of the human soul that we consider a man a hero because he wants to watch a group of grown men hit a ball with a stick. I recall sitting in a theater in a small town in Illinois, surrounded by people who were laughing so hard they were nearly falling out of their velvet seats. There was a scene where McMurphy, having been denied the right to watch the game, stands in front of a blank television screen and begins to narrate a fictional game with such fervor and intensity that the other inmates join him in a cheering frenzy. "Look at that!" a man in the row behind me whispered, his voice thick with admiration. "He's seeing things that aren't there, and he's making everyone else see 'em too. That's a leader of men right there. He'd make a fine governor." "I think he's just trying to annoy the nurse," I replied. "Exactly," the man said. "What else is politics for?" The film went on to do something that had only happened once before in the history of the Academy Awards. It won the Big Five. It took home the prize for Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, Best Actress, and Best Screenplay. It was a clean sweep, a total victory for the lunatics. The American public embraced the movie because we felt in 1975 that we were all living in Nurse Ratched's ward. We felt that the world was being run by people who spoke in soft, reasonable tones while they slowly tightened the screws on our lives. We wanted someone to throw a water fountain through a window and run toward the mountains. But there is a darker side to the story, a side that reminds us that the system usually wins in the end. Without giving away the conclusion for those of you who have been living under a rock, perhaps the very pet rock we discussed earlier, it is enough to say that the house always has the advantage. Yet the film left us with a sense of hope in the form of a giant, silent gentleman known as Chief Bromden. The chief, a man who has spent years pretending to be deaf and dumb as a way of surviving the ward, finally finds his voice and his strength, and he becomes the one who flies over the nest. There is something deeply sleep-inducing about the atmosphere of that hospital ward. If you ignore the lobotomies and the institutional cruelty, it is a very quiet place. Think of the long white hallways. Think of the soft, rhythmic sound of the floor polisher. Think of the low murmur of the group therapist sessions, where people discuss their problems in the slow, circular fashion of a dog trying to find the perfect place to lie down. Imagine you are sitting in one of those vinyl chairs. The room is pleasantly cool. The lights are a bit dim. Nurse Ratched is standing at her station, her cap perfectly straight, her eyes fixed on a clipboard. She isn't angry with you. She just wants you to be cooperative. She wants you to listen to the music, a soft, tinkling sort of music that sounds like a music box that has been left out in the rain. You don't have to fight the system tonight. You don't have to lead a revolution. You don't even have to watch the World Series. McMurphy has already done all the shouting for you. He's out there somewhere laughing in the dark, and you are here, safe in the silence. The year 1975 was a year of cuckoo's nests. We were all trying to find a way to stay sane in a world that insisted on its own peculiar brand of madness. But tonight, the ward is quiet. The chief has already broken the window, and the cool night air is blowing in through the jagged glass. It's a fresh wind, a mountain wind, and it carries the scent of pine and freedom. Close your eyes and listen to the silence. It is the silence of a room where the struggle has finally ceased. The medication is taking effect. Not the kind that comes in a paper cup, but the kind that comes from realizing that you are at last off the clock. The world can run itself for a few hours. The rules are suspended. The keys are in the lock. But you don't need to leave. You are already exactly where you need to be. Good night, Jack. Good night, Chief. Good night to all the lost souls who are just looking for a way home. The nest is empty, the bird has flown, and the only thing left to do is drift away on the wings of the night. Chapter 17. The Thriller in Manila. I have often noticed that the progress of civilization is measured by the increasing distance between the man who does the bleeding and the man who pays to watch it. In the ancient days of Rome, a gentleman had to get his boots dusty and risk a stray splash of gore at the Colosseum if he wished to see a fellow creature dissected by a lion. By the time we reached the 19th century, we had refined the spectacle into the prize fight, where two men in breeches pounded each other in a hayfield while the local constabulary looked the other way for the price of a pint. But in the year of our Lord 1975, we achieved the pinnacle of human refinement. We arranged for two of the finest physical specimens in the world to attempt to murder each other in a steam-heated arena in the Philippines, while the rest of us watched from the safety of our wood-paneled dens, wearing our pajamas and eating crackers. They called it The Thriller in Manila. It is a title that possesses the rhythmic, nonsensical charm of a nursery rhyme, yet it heralded a collision so brutal that it made a train wreck look like a polite disagreement over a game of whist. The participants were, of course, Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier. Now, Muhammad Ali was a man whose mouth was a perpetual motion machine, a magnificent engine of poetry and provocation that could outrun a locomotive and out-talk a magpie. He was a man who had decided that the heavyweight championship of the world was not merely a sports title, but a divine commission to remind everyone else of their own inadequacy. Joe Frazier, on the other hand, was a man who believed in the theology of the left hook. He was as silent and as relentless as a rising tide, a man who didn't care much for rhyme or meter, as long as he could find a way to deposit his fist into the ribs of his opponent with the force of a falling safe. This was their third meeting, the rubber match. By October of 1975, the world was somewhat weary of their feud, much in the way one grows weary of a thunderstorm that refuses to move on. But the promoters, led by a gentleman named Don King, a man whose hair appeared to be trying to escape his head in a fit of permanent electrocuted terror, convinced us that this was the fight of the century, despite the century being only 3/4 finished and already having seen several dozen fights of the century previously. The location was Manila, chosen because the President of the Philippines, Ferdinand Marcos, was eager to prove to the world that his country was a thriving modern paradise and not at all a place where he was currently holding the entire population under his thumb like a collection of rare beetles. He offered a vast sum of money to host the fight, proving once again that if you want to see the sweet science at its most bitter, you must go where the air is thick with humidity and political tension. I have spent some time in the tropics, and I can tell you that there is a particular kind of heat in that part of the world that does not merely sit upon you. It attempts to move in and raise a family. Inside the Philippine Coliseum, under the glare of the television lights, the temperature was reported to be 120 degrees. It was not an arena. It was a kiln. To ask two men to engage in 15 rounds of combat in such a climate was an act of imaginative cruelty that would have impressed the Spanish Inquisition. The American public, however, was blissfully unaware of the suffering because of the magic of the satellite feed, a concept that in 1975 still felt like something borrowed from a Jules Verne novel. We were able to watch the fight live. We sat before our Zenith and RCA consoles, adjusting the vertical hold to keep the picture from sliding off the bottom of the screen, and marveled at the graininess of the image. It was like watching a boxing match through a screen door during a dust storm. But it was happening now. The fight itself was a tragedy in 14 acts. It was not a display of skill so much as it was a display of the terrifying durability of the human frame. For 42 minutes, these two men traded blows that would have leveled a stone wall. Ali danced and jabbed, his words finally silenced by the sheer effort of breathing air that felt like boiling soup. Frazier crouched and lunged, his face swelling into a mask of purple and red that no mother could love and no doctor could ignore. By the 14th round, the spectacle had transcended sport and entered the realm of the truly macabre. Both men were blind, exhausted, and operating on a level of primal instinct that bypasses the intellect entirely. Ali later remarked that he felt he was closer to death than he had ever been, which is a high price to pay for a gold-plated belt and the applause of a few thousand people in leisure suits. The end came when Frazier's trainer, a man of mercy named Eddie Futch, looked at his fighter's sightless eyes and refused to let him out for the final round. It was a rare moment of sanity in a year that was largely devoid of it. Ali was the winner, but as he stood there, his arms leaden and his brain rattling in his skull like a marble in a tin can, he didn't look like a victor. He looked like a man who had survived a shipwreck only to realize he had lost his shoes. There is a profound, sleep-inducing rhythm to a heavyweight fight when viewed from the distance of half a century. Think of the sounds of that Manila night, not the shouting of the crowd, which was muffled by the distance and the technology of the time, but the sounds within the ring, the rhythmic thud-thud of the gloves against leather and bone, the heavy, ragged breathing of the combatants, the dry, percussive slap of feet on the canvas. It is a hypnotic cadence. Jab, jab, hook. Step back, breathe. Jab, jab, hook. Imagine you are watching that grainy screen. The colors are muted. The blue of the canvas, the white of the trunks, the red of the blood. It is a flickering, distant dance. You aren't in the heat. You're in the cool of your own home. The clock on the wall is ticking toward midnight. The world is quiet. You're witnessing the end of an era, the moment when the great men of the ring proved they were only mortal after all. As Ali sinks onto his stool, his head bowed, the broadcast begins to fade. The announcers are winding down their excitement, their voices dropping into a low, appreciative murmur. The satellite link is growing weak, and the snow begins to fill the screen. A white, buzzing silence that covers the images of Manila like a digital blizzard. The struggle is over. The thriller has passed, leaving only the quiet and the dark. The two fighters are being led away to their dressing rooms, where they will spend the next few days trying to remember who they are. And you, my friend, are already there. You have no rounds left to fight. You have no punches to dodge. The heat of the arena has been replaced by the warmth of your blankets. The year 1975 was a heavy, bruising year, full of thrillers that no one asked for and rubber matches that no one won. But the bell has finally rung. The 14 rounds of your day are finished. The referee has raised the hand of the night, and you are the one who gets to take the nap. Close your eyes and listen to the white noise of the world. It is the sound of millions of satellites, all whispering shh at the same time. The Colosseum is empty. The lights are off, and the only champion left is the one who is currently snoring under a quilt. Good night, Ali. Good night, Joe. The fight is done, the sweat is dry, and the world is finally, mercifully, at peace. Chapter 18. The Sony Betamax, a short-lived king. It has often occurred to me that man is the only creature endowed with the peculiar arrogance to believe he can outsmart time itself. For centuries the sun rose, the sun set, and the events of the day vanished into the mists of memory, leaving nothing behind but a few exaggerated stories and a collection of unreliable memoirs. If you missed a sunset, you simply had to wait for the next one. If you missed a speech by a local magistrate, you were generally considered the luckier for it. But by the year of our Lord 1975, the human race had grown impatient with the natural order. We decided that we no longer wished to be slaves to the clock. We wanted to catch time by the tail, bottle it in a plastic cartridge, and play it back at our leisure while wearing our slippers and consuming a TV dinner. Thus entered the Sony Betamax, a machine of such prodigious weight and suspicious complexity that it promised to turn every American living room into a private cinematheque. In May of 1975, Sony unveiled the LV-1901, a console that combined a 19-inch color television with a wood-grained video recorder. It was a singular contrivance, a piece of furniture that looked as though it had been designed by a committee of naval architects and Victorian undertakers. It was heavy enough to alter the gravitational pull of a small house, and it cost roughly $2,500, a sum which, in 1975, could also buy you a fleet of used cars or a modest plantation in the Delta. The primary appeal of this mechanical behemoth was a concept known as time shifting. This was a term of such grand science fiction proportions that it suggested one might use the Betamax to travel back to the signing of the Declaration of Independence, or perhaps warn Caesar about the Ides of March. In reality, it meant that a suburban housewife in Peoria could record All My Children at noon and watch it at 6, thereby ensuring that the soap opera's relentless cycle of amnesia and secret twins would never be interrupted by the trivialities of grocery shopping or civic duty. I recall visiting the home of a gentleman who had recently mortgaged his soul to acquire one of these machines. He stood before the Betamax with the reverent awe of a priest approaching an altar. "Observe, Mark," he whispered, gesturing toward a cassette the size of a substantial ham sandwich. "This is a magnetic tape. On this ribbon of rust and plastic, I can capture the flickering ghosts of the evening news. I can preserve the image of Walter Cronkite for all eternity. I am no longer a victim of the network schedule. I am the master of my own shadows." "It is a noble ambition," I replied, "to wish to preserve Mr. Cronkite. But have you considered what you shall do when your shelves are groaning under the weight of these plastic loaves? You are trading the freedom of the moment for the slavery of the archive. You shall spend your retirement watching the weather reports of 1975, wondering why you cared so much about a cold front in Cincinnati." The Betamax tape itself was a marvel of misguided perfection. It was compact, it was sturdy, and the picture quality was remarkably clear, or at least as clear as a 1975 television set would allow, which is to say it looked like a painting rendered in mud and neon. But Sony, in its infinite wisdom, had made one fatal miscalculation. They believed that the American public possessed an attention span that lasted exactly 60 minutes. The original Betamax tapes could only record 1 hour of footage. Now an hour is a perfectly reasonable length of time for a sermon, a nap, or a dental extraction. It is not, however, a reasonable length of time for a professional football game or a cinematic epic. This led to a peculiar national tragedy where thousands of citizens would sit down to watch a recorded movie, only to have the tape run out exactly 3 minutes before the hero kissed the girl or the detective revealed that the butler had indeed committed the crime with the candlestick. This limitation created a market for a rival format, the VHS, which arrived shortly thereafter with the revolutionary, if somewhat lower quality ability to record for 2 hours. Sony insisted that their Beta was the superior technology, a claim they maintained with the stubbornness of a captain going down with a ship that had plenty of lifeboats, but refused to use them because they were the wrong color. But for a brief shining moment in 1975, the Betamax was the king of the parlor. It represented the ultimate luxury, the ability to own a broadcast. Before the VCR, television was a phantom. It came through the air, danced upon the glass for a moment, and vanished. The Betamax turned the phantom into a physical object. It gave a man the right to say to his neighbor, "I have the 1975 World Series on my bookshelf right between the Encyclopedia Britannica and a biography of Harry Truman." There is something profoundly sleep-inducing about the mechanical operation of a 1975 video recorder. If you've ever sat in a quiet room and listened to the Betamax at work, you know the sound of a very expensive, very polite ghost. Whir, click, clack. The tape is drawn from the cassette by a pair of mechanical arms that move with the slow, deliberate grace of a Tai Chi master. It is wrapped around a spinning drum that hums with a low-frequency vibration, a sound that resonates in the bones of the listener. It is the sound of industry miniaturized, a rhythmic, steady pulse that says, "Do not worry, the world is being recorded. You may close your eyes. I am watching the movie for you." Imagine the scene on a Tuesday night in November. The house is still. The only light comes from the glowing orange numbers of the Betamax's digital clock. The only clock in the house that actually shows the correct time, as it hasn't yet had a power outage to leave it blinking 12 o'clock for the next 3 years. The machine is time-shifting. It is eating the airwaves, its little red light glowing like a watchful eye. The sound of the spinning head is like a distant lawn mower in a dream. It is a white noise that blankets the room, muffling the sounds of the street, the ticking of the grandfather clock, and the distant bark of a dog. You are tucked into your armchair, a quilt of questionable aesthetic value over your knees. You don't have to stay awake to see the end of the show. The machine is taking care of it. It is holding the moment for you, cradling it in its magnetic arms. The year 1975 was a year of the record. We were recording our history, our follies, and our favorite sitcoms. We were building a wall of plastic cases against the inevitable march of time. But as the machine whirs on, you realize that the most precious thing it provides isn't the recording itself, but the peace of mind that comes from knowing you could watch it later. And later is a wonderful place. A land where there are no deadlines, no oil embargoes, and no leisure suits that don't fit. The tape is nearing the end of its spool. The hum is growing softer, more intimate. The mechanical arms are preparing to retract. The shadows on the wall are long and still. The digital clock flickers to 11 p.m. The task is complete. The ghosts of 1975 have been successfully captured and filed away. Close your eyes and listen to that final thunk of the eject button. It is a soft, domestic sound, the sound of a job well done. You have shifted time, and now time is shifting you toward the quiet, toward the dark, toward the dreamless state where no recording is necessary. The screen is a vast, cooling gray. The tubes are silent. The wood-grained console is just a shadow in the corner. You are the master of the shadows now, and you have decided that the best use of your time is to let it pass without interference. Good night, Sony. Good night, Betamax. The hour's up, the tape is full, and the world is finally off the air. Chapter 19. Pong, the peak of athleticism. It has always been a source of profound and settling melancholy to me that the human race is forever looking for ways to exert itself without actually having to stand up. We are a species that has spent 10,000 years inventing the plow, the steam engine, and the automobile, all so that we might eventually achieve our ultimate destiny. Sitting perfectly still in a darkened room while a machine does the heavy lifting of existence for us. In the year of our Lord 1975, this long trek toward total inertia reached its magnificent flickering summit. We did not go to the gymnasium, we did not run through the meadows, and we did not swing a heavy racket on a grass court. No, we went to the local tavern, climbed upon a vinyl-top stool, and engaged in the most strenuous athletic pursuit of the 20th century, a game called Pong. Now, if you were to describe Pong to a gentleman from the 19th century, or even to a sensible child of the 21st, you would be met with a look of pitying bewilderment. The graphics of the game consisted of 2 vertical lines and a single square dot. It was not a grand vista. It was not a masterpiece of the digital arts. It was a black void with 3 glowing white rectangles, and it possessed the aesthetic charm of a chalkboard in a haunted schoolhouse. Yet, to the American public of 1975, this was not merely a game. It was a miracle. It was the moment we realized that we could control the shadows on our television screens, a power previously reserved for the engineers at the networks and the Almighty. I recall my first encounter with this digital marvel in a dimly lit establishment in St. Louis. The machine sat in the corner, a wood-grained cabinet that hummed with a low electrical thirst. It was surrounded by men who, under any other circumstances, would have been discussing the rising price of corn or the deplorable state of the municipal sewage system. Instead, they were standing in a state of rapt, breathless silence, their eyes fixed upon that wandering square dot with the intensity of a navigator trying to find the North Star in a hurricane. "What is the object of the exercise?" I asked a gentleman whose grip on his beer mug was so tight that his knuckles had turned the color of a fresh turnip. "The object," he whispered, his eyes never leaving the screen, "is to not let the square pass the line. You turn the knob. The line moves. The square bounces. It is the very essence of combat, Mark. It is man against machine. It is the struggle for survival in a world of binary logic." "And what happens if the square does pass the line?" I inquired. "The machine makes a sound like a disappointed bullfrog," he replied, "and you lose your quarter. It is a tragedy of the highest order." The sound of Pong is one of the most singular and sleep-inducing auditory experiences in the history of human folly. It is a rhythmic, hollow, and utterly repetitive percussion. Pock, pock, pock. It was a sound that suggested a very small, very bored ghost was playing a game of marbles in the back of your skull. It lacked the drama of a cheering crowd. It lacked the music of a marching band. It was merely the sound of a digital collision occurring over and over again until the very concept of time began to dissolve into a gray mist. There was a peculiar kind of pong-eye that afflicted the players of 1975. After 20 minutes of watching that square dot bounce back and forth, the eyes would begin to glaze over with a sort of wholly technological stupor. The player's head would tilt rhythmically from left to right, echoing the movement of the ball until he looked less like an athlete and more like a human metronome. It was a form of mass hypnosis. I have seen a man play Pong for 3 hours straight, and at the end of it, he could not tell you his own middle name, but he could tell you with absolute certainty that the paddle moved faster when you turned the dial to the right. The manufacturers of the game, a company called Atari, had achieved something that the great philosophers had failed to do for centuries. They had simplified life down to a single binary choice. The ball is either on your side or it is on the other side. You either hit it or you do not. There were no unforced errors involving the wind. There were no bad calls by a nearsighted umpire. There were no rain delays. It was a world of perfect, predictable physics, a relief to a nation that was currently trying to understand why their president was falling downstairs and why their gasoline cost more than a fine Kentucky bourbon. We called it athleticism, but it was the athleticism of the wrist and the ego. We told ourselves we were gamers, a word that in 1975 suggested we were risk-takers, pioneers on a new frontier of leisure. In reality, we were just people who enjoyed watching a square bounce off a line. We were easily amused because the world had become so complicated that simple felt like a luxury. I once witnessed a Pong tournament in a shopping mall in Ohio. It was a spectacle of extraordinary gravity. Young men in bell-bottomed trousers and shirts with collars large enough to serve as sails for a clipper ship stood before the consoles with the grim determination of Roman gladiators. Their brows were furrowed. Their lips were pressed together in a thin line of concentration. They were competing for a trophy that looked like it was made of gilded plastic and a $50 gift certificate to a store that sold nothing but macrame supplies. "Look at them," I said to a bystander. "They are the new champions of the Republic. They have conquered the square dot. They have mastered the art of the English, that subtle twist of the knob that sends the ball off at a treacherous angle. Surely our future is secure." "I don't know about the future," the bystander said, "but I know that my son hasn't spoken a word to me in 3 days. He just stands in the garage and makes pock noises with his mouth." This is the great sleep-inducing truth of the year 1975. We were a nation that had been ponged into submission. The repetitive nature of the game acted as a digital sedative. If you watch a square dot bounce for long enough, your brain eventually decides that there is no point in thinking about anything else. The worries of the world, the Cold War, the inflation, the polyester shortage, all fade into the background. There is only the ball. There is only the paddle. Imagine yourself now sitting in that dimly lit room. The only light comes from the glowing screen. The air is thick with the scent of stale popcorn and the hum of the electronics. You reach out and turn the knob. It moves with a smooth, oily resistance. Pock! The ball hits your paddle and begins its slow, steady journey to the other side of the screen. You watch it go. You don't have to hurry. It isn't moving fast. It is a leisurely ball, a ball that knows it has all the time in the world. Pock! It hits the other paddle. It starts to come back. Your eyelids are growing heavy. The movement is so regular, so predictable, so comforting. It is like the swing of a pendulum in an old clock. It is like the heartbeat of a very large, very peaceful machine. Pock! 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 The sound is growing fainter. The screen is growing dimmer. You don't even need to turn the knob anymore. You can just let the ball pass. It doesn't matter. The score is reset at the end of the game anyway. There is no permanent record of your digital failures. There is only the silence that follows the final pock. The year 1975 was a year of progress, and Pong was our trophy. We had successfully turned the television, that great engine of information and propaganda, into a toy. We had taken the most sophisticated technology in human history and used it to play a game of catch with ourselves. It was a magnificent surrender to the trivial. As you drift off tonight, imagine that square dot. It is still bouncing somewhere in the vast black void of the digital universe. It doesn't get tired. It doesn't need to sleep. But you do. You have turned your knob for the last time today. You have defended your line. You have earned your rest. The machine is being unplugged. The glowing lines are fading. The pock sound has died away, replaced by the soft, steady breathing of the night. The world of 1975 is winding down, its batteries nearly empty, its pixels vanishing into the dark. Good night, Atari. Good night, champion of the bar stool. The game is over, the score is 0-0, and the only thing left to do is let the ball go by and sink into the deep, dark, velvet silence of the screen. Chapter 20. The end of the beginning. It has been my experience that every great drama in human history eventually concludes not with a trumpet blast or a celestial choir, but with the weary sigh of a man who has realized he is late for dinner and has lost his car keys. We are a species that begins every century with a magnificent roar and ends every decade with a profound need for a foot bath and a darkened room. In the waning days of the year 1975, the United States of America looked at itself in the mirror, a mirror likely framed in gold-painted plastic, and decided that it had seen quite enough of its own reflection for the time being. The year had been a singular and baffling journey through the thickets of the absurd. We had survived the gospel of the pet rock. We had endured the tragedy of the leisure suit, and we had witnessed the handshake in space, which proved that even the most bitter enemies can find common ground, provided they are surrounded by a vacuum and a distinct lack of gravity. We had seen a president lose his footing on the world stage and a city lose its credit at the bank. We had watched a mechanical shark terrorize the coastline and a digital square dot hypnotize the interior. And as the calendar prepared to flip its final page, we found ourselves in a state of grace that can only be described as universal exhaustion. It is a common error of historians to believe that the importance of a year is measured by the number of treaties signed or the amount of territory conquered. This is a fallacy of the highest order. The true importance of a year is measured by its lullaby factor, its ability to convince the human race that it has done enough for one day, and that it is perfectly acceptable to pull the covers up to one's chin and let the future take care of itself. 1975 was a champion in this regard. It was the middle child of decades, a beige hallway between the frantic, idealistic shouting of the 60s and the neon-soaked, greedy whispering of the 80s. It was a year that didn't want to change the world. It just wanted to make sure the world didn't make too much noise while we were trying to watch the Jeffersons. I recall sitting on a porch in the twilight of that December, watching a neighbor try to remove a bicentennial decal from his station wagon. The decal was a stubborn thing, a mix of red, white, and blue adhesive that had become one with the simulated wood paneling of the car. "It won't come off, Mark," the neighbor said, his breath hitching in the cold air. "I think the spirit of '76 has been permanently fused to my Ford. I shall be patriotic for the next 12,000 miles, whether I like it or not." "Consider it a blessing," I replied. "It is a reminder that we are a nation that is perpetually under construction. We have painted the hydrants, we have bought the rocks, and we have recorded the soaps. We have done the work of being ridiculous, and now we have earned the right to be silent." "I'm just tired," he said, dropping his scraper. "I'm tired of the news, I'm tired of the polyester, and I'm tired of trying to remember which color my mood ring was supposed to be when I'm feeling cautiously optimistic." "Then go to bed," I suggested. "The year is almost over, and 1976 is waiting in the wings with a drum and a fife. Let it wait. The drums are loud, but the pillows are soft. There is a profound and sleep-inducing symmetry to the end of such a year. We started in a state of confusion, and we ended in a state of contentment. We realized that we didn't need to understand the computer. We didn't need to find Jimmy Hoffa, and we didn't need to fear the shark. These were all just special effects in the grand cinematic production of our lives. 1975 was a year that taught us the value of the trivial. It taught us that when the world becomes too heavy to carry, the best response is to find a very small, very smooth stone and give it a name. Imagine the nation now, as the final midnight of the year approaches. The leisure suits are being hung in the back of the closets, where they will remain until they are discovered by bewildered grandchildren in the next century. The pet rocks are being tucked into their cardboard crates, their little air holes providing a steady supply of imaginary oxygen. The Altair 8800s are being switched off, their red lights fading like dying embers in a hearth. The sound of 1975 is the sound of a long, slow wind down. It is the whir of the Betamax tape reaching its end. It is the final pock of the Pong game. It is the soft, rhythmic clicking of a grandmother's knitting needles as she finishes a bicentennial sweater for a grandson who would much rather have a bicycle. Click, click, click. It is a hypnotic, steady rhythm. It is the pulse of a world that is safe, predictable, and deeply, wonderfully boring. There is no drama in the darkness. There are no sharks in the bathtub. There are no presidents on the stairs. There is only the long, long shadow of the night, stretching across the continent from the Atlantic to the Pacific. You have walked through the chapters of this hilarious history, and you have survived them all. You have seen the follies and the fabrics, and you have laughed at the absurdity of it all. But laughter is a tiring business. It requires the use of several dozen muscles and a fair amount of oxygen. Now, the muscles are relaxed. The oxygen is being used for the slow, steady business of slumber. The book is closing. The wood-grain television is cooling down. The digital clock on the nightstand is glowing with a soft green light. The only light left in a room that is as quiet as a Martian gravel pit. You are not a pet. You are not a contestant. And you're not a not ready for prime time player. You are simply a human being, and you have reached the end of the beginning. The year 1976 is coming, with its parades and its fireworks and its relentless patriotism. But that is a story for tomorrow. Tonight, you belong to 1975, the year of the nap, the year of the polyester piece, the year that proved that even when we lose our way, we can always find comfort in a square dot and a good night's rest. Close your eyes and breathe in the scent of the cooling air. The bicentennial itch has been scratched. The greatest year in history is over, and it was perfectly, magnificently unimportant. The world is a vast, quiet bedroom, and the stars are the only blinking lights you need to worry about. They have been there for millions of years, and they don't require any software to work. The thriller is over. The fire sale is closed. The cuckoo's nest is silent. Good night, 1975. Good night to the rocks and the rings and the records. The tape has run out, the wheel has stopped spinning, and the only prize left is the deep, dark velvet dream that is waiting for you just behind your eyelids. Sleep now. The polyester is soft, the bed is steady, and the world is, finally, exactly as it should be, asleep. The end. This has been Mark Twain.